This video is a complete guide to the carnivore diet. It has 18 chapters and covers everything you need to know. My promise to you is that by the end of this video, you'll know everything you need to do and not do in order to be successful on the carnivore diet. On screen right now, you can see the topics we will be discussing. Notable topics include how we know that humans are a carnivorous species and why it's so important for us to eat the exact same way our ancestors did, as well as debunking all the myths surrounding the carnivore diet, such as cholesterol and the lack of fibre, what to expect when starting, and how to avoid the most common mistakes that people make. I hope you enjoy. Let's get into chapter 1. Every single species is designed to eat a certain type of food, and if they eat something different, they become incredibly sick. For example, lions are a carnivorous species designed to only eat meat, and if they start eating grass, they become incredibly sick. In fact, every single wild animal has very little disease. And where it gets interesting is that as soon as humans take in these animals and start caring for them, feeding them a diet that they're not used to, they get incredibly sick. Now the exact same goes with humans. Wild humans like the Inuit in Alaska have virtually zero illness. They live long and healthy lives. However, civilized humans, 1 in 2 of us get cancer. If a species eats its true species-appropriate diet, it doesn't get sick. So what is the species-appropriate diet that humans are meant to eat? Now for the last year, I've obsessed over this topic, and after looking at all the evidence, I'm highly convinced that humans are designed to only eat meat. And I've come up with 31 of the most compelling reasons why I believe this to be true. I'm going to keep every point in this video very brief, so the video is not 3 hours long. So I'm only going to touch briefly on each topic. But if you have any questions on any of the points I make, leave them down in the comments and I'll respond to them. Now, technically speaking, we only became humans a few 100,000 years ago. But for the sake of making this video simple, I'm going to refer to our ancestors as humans. The first argument is a rather straightforward one: intuition. What do wild animals eat? Well, it's very simple. They eat what they're intuitively drawn to. Wild animals don't have teams of scientists saying to them, hey, make sure you eat this over here. It contains 100% of your RDA for iron. Even though it tastes terrible, you need to eat this. Instead, it's very simple. If they're drawn to something, they eat it. And a large factor as to what they eat is what tastes good to them. And what are humans intuitively drawn to and what tastes amazing to us? It's very simple. Meat. Think about it. If you went on a massive hike, got lost in the bush for days, and thought to yourself, okay, I need to get something to eat, your first thought would be, which animals are around? And the reason for this is you know that plants are toxic, and by eating them, it might poison you and you might die. Which rather conveniently brings me into my second point. Plants are toxic. Every single plant on the planet has something known as defense chemicals. And the purpose of these chemicals are to deter it from being killed and eaten. In fact, every single vegetable that humans eat has over 60 identified carcinogens in it. When we eat plants, we get a bad feedback mechanism in the sense that it tastes very bitter, which is our body's way of recognizing the plant's defense chemicals and the carcinogens in that food. An example of one of these defense chemicals are tannins, which are found in foods like kale, spinach, cocoa. Now, when you eat one of these foods with tannins, what happens is that it causes proteins to bind together, which blocks the absorption of nutrients and causes us digestive issues. Which brings me on to my third point. We have no defense mechanisms against these plants. What ends up happening is when a species consumes the same plant for an extended period of time, they start to develop adaptations to counteract these chemicals. This is what is known as the evolutionary arms race, and it's no different to Russia and America racing to see who can have the best weapon. An example of one of these is goats. In their saliva, they have an enzyme called tannins. Now, what this enzyme does is when they consume tannins, it breaks it down so it doesn't affect them. Now, every single species develops adaptations like this when they consume a plant for an extended period of time. Another example of this is gorillas, who have massive intestines, which allows them to ferment plant material, which turns it into short-chain fatty acids and proteins before they consume it, essentially purifying it so these toxins don't affect them. Humans, on the other hand, have very short intestines and no ability to ferment anything. In fact, we literally cannot digest fibre, which according to all these experts, somehow makes it good for us. What's incredibly fascinating about gorillas is that they eat 18 kilograms of leaves per day, which, as we all know with foods like spinach, leaves have virtually no calories in them. So when you look at the total calories that gorillas consume, it seems that they're virtually having nothing. However, gorillas are hindgut digesters, which means that they can use their cecum and large intestines to turn fibre into short-chain fatty acids and proteins, like I mentioned earlier. Now, gorillas consume over 1 kilogram of fibre per day, and this process allows them to turn each gram of fibre into 2 calories, which significantly bumps their caloric intake up, and even though they have to eat for the majority of their day, it allows them to survive. However, once again, humans can't do this. We literally cannot break down fiber, which is why it has 0 calories. The next reason is our stomach pH levels. How this works is the more carnivorous a species is, the more acidic that their stomachs are. For those who don't know, a lower pH means a more acidic stomach. Now meat, as we all know, expires, which means over time it gets pathogens and bacteria on it. However, plants take a lot longer to go off, which is why all carnivore species have very acidic stomachs and the herbivores don't. Now our stomach pH is around 1.5. To put this into context, lions and wolves both have a stomach pH of between 1 and 2, essentially the same as ours. For herbivores, it's much higher. Now for each 1 increase of pH is a 10-fold increase in acidity. So the difference between a pH of 1 and a pH of 3 is 100 times more acidic. The next reason is something known as stable isotopes. Now when we find fossils, they contain nitrogen. The more nitrogen a fossil has, the more carnivorous it is. Now every fossil we find pre-agricultural revolution, which we'll get into shortly, has incredibly high nitrogen ratings, higher than every other species on the planet. Now before we get into the next points, I need to explain this theory. Our earliest ancestors, which had tiny brains like the other primate species, ate predominantly plants. However, something happened 2.5 million years ago which caused our brains to start growing massively. Now this conveniently lines up with when the Ice Age is estimated to start and when we discovered stone tools. Now what the Ice Age meant is that the entire Earth was covered in ice, which would have covered a lot of the plants and it would have made it incredibly hard for us to survive only eating plants as there would be so few of them, which meant we had to get creative and start eating animals if we want to survive. Hence why we created stone tools. Now where things get interesting is that only the fatty animals would have been able to survive, which meant that we had access to the right types of fat. The human brain requires 20 and 22 carbon fatty acids. Now this type of fatty acids makes up 90% of the brain material in mammals. In plants there's only 18 carbon fatty acids, which cannot be used to make this brain material. So there's no explanation for this brain growth other than the increase of animal fats, which, as I mentioned, lines up perfectly with the Ice Age and the introduction of stone tools. Now this brain growth continued to skyrocket up until about 12,000 years ago. And then in the last 12,000 years, they've shrunk 11% again. Now why is this? The agricultural revolution. For the last 12,000 years, humans have been using agriculture to get most of our calories, which lines up perfectly with when the last ice age ended. Now obviously if the entire earth is covered in ice, it's not possible for agriculture. So this timeline makes perfect sense. This decrease in brain size is due to the fact that we have less 20 and 22 carbon fatty acids in our diet. Now every fossil we found before 12,000 years ago is in perfect shape. There's very little lesions or markings on their bones. Now this is important because these indicate infection or disease. However, in the last 12,000 years, these lesions and markings have been found on fossils. Now isn't this an interesting timeline? Small brain, start eating meat. Big brain, stop eating meat, smaller brain, and is explained by the fact that we're not having the right type of fatty acids anymore. Another thing we've noticed since the agricultural revolution is a decrease in height. On older fossils that we find, we see tribes of people that are estimated to be 6'2" on average, whereas nowadays the average height is 5'7.5". On these more recent fossils within the last 12,000 years, we've also started to find cavities on the teeth, which were not present pre-agricultural revolution. It's interesting how the jaw structure of every single human was perfect back then, whereas nowadays many people have very messed up teeth and very small jaws. Now the reason for this is because we've stopped eating meat, we've stopped having to use our jaws, and we don't have access to the nutrients in meat which helps it form properly. Now over time we've also had a lot of adaptations that suggest we started hunting more and more. A key one of these are changes in our feet. Our big toes more aligned with the rest of the foot. We have more of an arch. Our toes are shorter and as a whole, our foot has become more rigid. All of these suggest we've had to walk and run for greater distances, which indicates hunting, as if we were eating plants, we wouldn't have to move around very much. If you look at the way other primates walk who don't move around very much, they're very bent over. However, over time, humans have developed and become more and more upright. The next is a change in our ribcage structure. As we mentioned earlier, it's believed that earliest humans ate plants, which is why when we find very old fossils, we find a very different ribcage structure to the ones we find on humans nowadays. Our old ribcage structure suggests we had much larger intestines than we do now. However, over time this ribcage got smaller and smaller, suggesting our intestines got smaller as they no longer need to ferment plants because we're eating other animals. Now we've also developed an incredible ability to rotate our shoulders. All you have to do is turn your television on and watch a game of baseball to see this in action. No other species has developed this, and the reason we have is from throwing spears at animals over and over. The next adaptation is that we don't have flat teeth. Herbivore species have flat teeth. Not only are our teeth not perfectly flat, but we've also developed our canine teeth. We also have predator eyes. Now, we didn't always have these, and we've developed them over time. The difference between predator and prey eyes is that prey eyes can see in more directions to detect if predators are coming towards them. Now, we also have many cave paintings that we've found, which depict hunting practices. Now, it goes to show how important hunting was back then, if that's what they've decided to draw. And as Dr. Anthony Chaffee has made famous, I've never seen a cave painting of a salad. Now, another reason is that even so-called herbivores eat meat when given the opportunity, which shows us that intuitively even these animals know that eating meat is the best source for them to get their calories, to avoid the toxins, and to get all the nutrients that they need. And that the reason they don't eat these more frequently is that they're simply not smart enough. Now, these animals don't have the capabilities like the throwing arm that we have to use these weapons, and they're not smart enough to create them in the first place, which is why they're stuck on their herbivore diets. And it's why their brains haven't increased in size like ours have. Now, another reason is something known as coprolites. Essentially, coprolites are fossilized stools of animals. And in all these coprolites that we never find any plant material, which you'd expect to find at least some seeds if we were consuming plants. However, we do find the remains of smaller animals that we ate, such as fish bones and fish heads. Now, a common argument is, why would we want to eat like our ancestors who only lived to 40? However, this is simply not true. There's no way to detect how old someone was when they died simply by looking at a fossil. In the last 12,000 years, there hasn't been a civilization that only ate meat. So it's not like we can just pull up some records and see how old everyone lived eating only meat. But what we do know is that there was less infection and less disease when we ate this way. Now, humans, medically speaking, are meant to live to the age of 120. Assuming our bodies don't get in the way of ourselves and there's no inflammation, that's how long every organ in our body is meant to live for. So you'd think that if you ate only the food without a single identified carcinogen that contained every single nutrient we need, that you'd probably live a pretty long and healthy life, right? Another reason why we're meant to be carnivores is exactly that. If meat's the only food without a single identified carcinogen in it, and every other food has some toxins, which we don't have mechanisms to break down, wouldn't that be the best food for us to eat? Now, vegetables were sold to us as the best way to get your nutrients in, but we now know that these nutrients in plants are almost impossible for us to break down. However, red meat contains every single nutrient we need in the perfect quantity, assuming that you eat a decent amount of it every day. Now, what is the likelihood of this from chance acting alone? Over time, our bodies would have become accustomed to getting this amount of nutrients, which is why in order to thrive, we continue to need that amount. Another reason is that carbohydrates are toxic to us. When we eat carbohydrates, it spikes our blood sugar massively. And high blood sugar essentially kills us. This is called glycation, which essentially means that glucose molecules damage other molecules in our body and inflammation builds up over time. And every single plant contains carbohydrates. Cancer also feeds on sugar. A cancer cell uses considerably more glucose than regular cells. I mentioned earlier that gorillas can ferment plant material and turn it into short-chain fatty acids and protein. Now, they're not the only species that can do this. A lot of species do. However, humans can't do this, which is why carbohydrates remain toxic to us. The next reason is that it's the only way we could have got our calories in. As I mentioned earlier with the Ice Age and all the plants being frozen over, meat was literally the only thing we could eat during this time, so of course we were a carnivorous species. The next point is that ketosis is a massive survival benefit. When you are not fat adapted, as soon as you run out of the calories you've eaten, you become incredibly hungry, lethargic, and you simply feel terrible. Now imagine this happened before we had these things called supermarkets. Every time you run out of calories, you felt terrible. It would make it incredibly hard to get your next meal, which would have inhibited our evolution considerably. However, no other species has evolved like us. The next reason is that it tastes amazing. As I mentioned earlier, our bodies recognize that this is the best food for us, so we get a positive feedback mechanism. Now this brings fruit into the debate, because fruit does taste good to the human palate. At the end of this video, I will link to another video I made, breaking down why I don't think eating fruit is a good idea. Another reason is that we can come up with a best guess. We can look at what wild humans are eating nowadays, and assume that we've probably eaten like this for a while. Now what do wild humans eat? As much meat as they can possibly get their hands on. Sure, when people go visit some of these hunter-gatherer tribes, like the Hadza, we see them eating things like tubers and berries. However, these tribes do not have an abundance of animals around them. And when you say to these people, do you like the tubers? They're not particularly fond of it, which further supports that plants should only be survival foods for humans. We even have a biblical reference for the religious viewers, which tells the story of a man named Abel who offered a sheep to the Lord, and a man named Cain who offered the fruit of the ground to the Lord. The Lord had respect to Abel's offering. However, to Cain, he did not respect this offering, which shows meat being regarded as superior to plants. Reason number 30 is that virtually every single person that goes on an all-meat carnivore diet feels way better. Now let's imagine that humans were another species, say your dog for example, and you decide to start feeding it something different. Now obviously your dog's not going to say to you, yo gee, I'm feeling a lot better on this new food you've given me. But you will notice tangible differences in its energy levels. It will be more playful, which is essentially the human equivalent of what happens on a carnivore diet. Now if suddenly this did happen, you changed your dog's food and he's noticeably doing better, there is absolutely zero chance you would come to the conclusion that what he's eating now is worse than what he's eaten before. However, for some reason, when humans experience this on a carnivore diet, all these so called experts like to point at some terrible association studies and tell us that our new diet's worse. My final point, which is more rebuttal of a vegan argument, now the argument goes like this. Just because some populations were eating meat, it doesn't mean that humans were entirely carnivorous species. Now, this could be rebutted with the Ice Age argument, but instead I've come up with a much more scientific one. If you look at any history book, there were always massive conflicts between civilizations which ended in large-scale wars. So let's imagine two groups got into conflict about something and were going to war. On one side we have these carnivore doctors, Sean Baker, Chafee, Ken Berry, and then on the other side we have these vegan doctors. Now imagine entire tribes like this. Who do you think would win? Now let's say there was a vegan tribe out there. How long do you think it would last? The reason humans have evolved to such a large degree is because we ate meat for most of our existence. Now, have humans eaten plants from time to time, even pre-agricultural revolution? Of course we have, but it doesn't mean they're good for us. We don't have any adaptations to break down their defense chemicals, so in my opinion should only be considered survival foods, meaning we should only use them as a last resort if we're running out of calories. In today's video, I'm going to be breaking down why I, as a 21-year-old, will never eat a vegetable again. In the first part of this video, I'm going to be breaking down how plants are essentially trying to kill you, and how they do this through something known as biowarfare in the form of defense chemicals. Then we'll look at how some of these defense chemicals impact us, and how modern vegetables have been tampered with to the point that they're basically unrecognizable. And then finally, I'll break down exactly what I eat instead to ensure that I get all my nutrients. The sole goal of every living organism is to survive and reproduce. Now, animals do this through methods like biting, kicking, running, those sorts of things. However, plants are obviously stationary. They can't do any of these things. So they develop something known as defense chemicals. In fact, in every single vegetable that we commonly consume, there are over 60 different identified carcinogens in them. This is why vegetables have such a bitter taste. Our taste buds identify these defense chemicals, and as a result we get this unpleasant taste. This is not dissimilar to how our nose can smell when something's off, and therefore we get an unpleasant smell from something. Now let's take a brief look at some of the most well-known defense chemicals. First up, lectins. Lectins are a protein that binds to carbohydrates. Now the problem with lectins is not only do they bind to nutrients preventing their absorption, but they also bind to our gut, which causes inflammation. Lectins are present in many foods including wheat, oats, potatoes, beans, lentils. They're in so many plants and they cause great harm to humans. Then we have phytoestrogens, which is a type of defense chemical that mimics estrogen in our body and messes with all our hormones. This right here, in my opinion, is one of the key reasons why so many people are depressed and anxious nowadays. Everyone's hormones are just so out of whack. Now these are present in many of our foods, but the worst by far being soy. In soy there's just an absurd amount. These are also present in many other plants including cabbage, spinach, garlic, onion, and many other fruits and vegetables. Another defense chemical is cyanide, which isn't typically in vegetables. However, it's a very fascinating example of how these defense chemicals work. How cyanide works is it stops cells from being able to access oxygen, and essentially this can cause people to die. Cyanide has quite literally been used by assassins throughout history, as well as people that want to, well, to put it in a way that YouTube will allow, people that no longer want to live. There is a very famous example of a mass cyanide death in the Jonestown Massacre, in which a cult of 900 people died, mainly through mass suicide, and one of the main methods that they used was drinking cyanide. Now this alone is concerning. Every vegetable's sole goal is to harm us. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg. The next problem we're going to talk about is how vegetables have been crossbred for about 12,000 years. Ever since we came out of the Ice Age and started farming, humans have been crossbreeding plants. Now what this essentially means is they get two plants, grow them close to each other, and mix the pollens up from each plant, which basically develops this like hybrid style of plant. Now the goal of this is to mix favorable traits from each plant in order to build the ultimate plant, I guess you could call it. Now ideally in this ultimate plant, what you'd want is a pest resistant plant, a very large plant that provides lots of energy, and ideally, if possible, that it tastes good also. Now when you do this for an extended period, like we humans have done, it leads to plants looking unrecognizable. On screen right now, you can see exactly how different corn looks from when we first discovered it. And I mean broccoli, it's not even a real plant, we've just crossbred it from wild cabbage. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key traits farmers would look for in plants that they wanted to crossbreed was how pest resistant it was. Now for something to be more pest resistant, it means that it's going to be more defended, so it's going to have even more of these defense chemicals that we talked about earlier. And then if this wasn't bad enough, in more recent years we've even taken this a step further with something known as GMO. Now what GMO is scientists will get a plant, take it into a lab and essentially copy one gene and paste it into another plant. And often this gene is a pest resistant gene, so these plants are just becoming more and more defended. Now this has been much to the dismay of many people, and on the slide right now you'll see an image of people in the Philippines storming a field where one of these genetically modified plants was being grown. Now to make matters worse, vegetables bought from a store are going to be just doused in pesticides. On screen right now I have all the ingredients that you're consuming every single time you take a bite from a store-bought vegetable. Do you notice how one of the ingredients' sole goal is to leach into the vegetable as far as it can to prevent it from being washed off? These pesticides are designed to withstand against torrential rainfall, so do you really think that by the little rinse you give it before you cook it, it's going to do very much? And before you think you've outsmarted the system and you go for organic vegetables, all organic means is natural pesticides. Now, what does that even mean? When you think about it, at some point or another, everything comes from a natural source, so organic isn't what you think it is. These pesticides are designed to kill animals. Now, maybe they're not going to kill us, but I can guarantee they're not having very nice effects on us. Okay, so I've come to the conclusion that plants have a number of bad things about them. However, what about all the good? Plants have a lot of nutrients in them, right? But what has happened with the mass production of these plants for the consumer marketplace is that they've been grown in the same soils over and over again, and there hasn't been a chance for animals like cows to refertilize the soil like there would in a natural ecosystem. So what's happened is that all these soils have just been completely stripped of their nutrients. And then we have pesticides that have done even more damage to the soil. Now let's say you find some soil that still has some nutrients left in it. Plants still have a very poor bioavailability of the nutrients that they contain, which essentially means that we are not able to break down the nutrients in these plants. The defense chemicals in plants basically act as anti-nutrient substance, and it blocks our ability to break these things down. Fibre is one of these. Nutrients bind to fibre and they just pass straight through us. Lectins, like I talked about earlier, nutrients bind to lectins and we can't break them down. There are so many compounds in plants that do this. In fact, let's have a look at some studies that break this down. In this study titled Iron Deficiency, they found that humans could only absorb 1.4 to 7% of the iron in spinach, whereas in meat it was above 20%. Let's not forget that the iron in red meat is also higher to begin with than it is in spinach. And then we have another study, which again looked at the bioavailability of nutrients in plants versus animal products. And in this study, they concluded that the overview of studies showed that in general, vitamins in foods originating from animals are more bioavailable than vitamins in foods sourced from plants. Not to mention that there are many nutrients we can't even get from plants that we can only get in meat, such as vitamin B12, creatine, carnosine, the list goes on. Every single nutrient humans need to thrive can be found in meat. However, we cannot say the same thing for plants. When I eat something, there are three things I consider. How much good stuff does something contain? How much bad stuff does something contain? As well as, ideally, to be completely honest, I would like something that tastes nice. Ideally, we want as much of the good stuff as possible. And what do vegetables have? I guess a small amount of nutrients, but as we talked about, it's hard for us to absorb, and nowadays it's much less than it used to be anyway. And then obviously there's a little of the bad stuff as well. And as we've seen in this video, plants are highly defended, and they're even more defended now than they used to be because of all the selective crossbreeding. And then on top of that, most of them are covered in these synthetic pesticides nowadays anyways. I also do like my food to taste good, partially because I'm a human and, well, who doesn't want their food to taste good? But also in the sense that if something doesn't taste good, it's your body's way of warning you, hey, there's stuff in here that we don't want. So vegetables, they have very little good, a lot of bad, and then they taste pretty meh. So what do I eat instead? It's very simple. I follow a carnivore diet, the diet that humans have eaten for the majority of our existence. In meat, you can get every single nutrient you need, and have a guess at how many compounds we've identified in meat that are bad for us. That's right, absolutely zero. There has never been a study that's conclusively shown that meat is bad for us, and populations like the Inuit from hundreds of years ago, before they modernized and started eating the same garbage as us, had unbelievably good health, as well as the fact that when we look at fossil records from humans 12,000 years ago and beforehand, they were in remarkable shape. They had no lesions or markings on their bones, which indicated they had very little disease. However, all the fossils we find after this time period, in more recent years, in between 12,000 years ago and now, these fossils, they now have lesions and markings, which shows as soon as we start eating plants, our health started declining. If you're still watching at this point, you probably enjoy this type of content. So if you want to see more videos of mine, consider subscribing below. In today's video, we're going to be answering the question, is red meat bad for human health? Or to phrase the question slightly differently, are all of these modern diseases that seemingly appeared out of nowhere caused by the one food that humans have always eaten? On the agenda today, we're going to be looking at common myths regarding red meat. This video is going to be different to most other videos on this topic, as I'm just going to look at the prevalence of these diseases over time and how it lines up with our consumption of red meat. And I'm going to show you how none of these diseases even existed until recently. So how could the one food we've always eaten be the cause of them? After that, I'm going to present the case as to why I think that there is something else that might be behind these diseases. And I'm going to break down a concept known as healthy user bias and how it's ruined the credibility of most of the science we have regarding nutrition. So, allegedly, red meat causes every disease under the sun. You name it, red meat's gotten the blame. Some people even blame diabetes on red meat. You often hear arguments like the saturated fat clogs our arteries and we have heart attacks as a result, or that the meat just rots away in our digestive systems and it causes colorectal cancer and all of those other sorts of things. So, the first chart I want to present to you, which we're going to look at together, is a timeline of heart disease and heart attack incidences in the United States. Now, I need to give full credit to Dr. Chris Kenobi. He did a great speech on this on the YouTube channel Low Carb Down Under, which I highly recommend you guys check out. But he seems like a great guy, so I'm sure he won't mind me presenting his data to more people. So let's have a look at this together. In the entire 19th century, so from the year 1800 to the year 1900, there were 8 worldwide reports of heart attacks. Yep, that's right. For an entire century, 8 people had heart attacks. And for those of you who say, well, we didn't have records of everyone that died from heart attacks, that's simply not the case. We have records of so many things going back a very long time. And with heart attacks, people just drop dead. If this was something that was happening, believe me, the medical professionals, they would have taken note of this. Then, in the year 1912, there's the first ever recorded heart attack in the United States. So, before the year 1912, not a single incident of a heart attack. And keep in mind, what did everyone eat then? Everyone ate a lot of red meat, a lot of eggs. A lot of people's calories was coming from the saturated animal fats. Then by the 1930s, heart disease becomes the leading cause of death. A disease that did not exist 20 years ago is now the leading cause of death in the United States. And then in 2010, 32% of deaths in the United States were from heart disease. So in the span of 100 years, we've gone from 0 heart disease to 1/3 of Americans dying from it. Okay, now let's look at the cancer rates. So in the year 1811, 1 in 188 deaths were due to cancer. Then by the year 1900, it had increased significantly up to 1 in 17. Now obviously that's still not ideal, that's still a rather high cancer rate, but people were still eating things like plants, which we know are offended and stuff. But where it gets worse is it goes from 1 in 17 people in the year 1900 to 1 in 3 people dying of cancer in 2010. That is a monumental increase. Then we look at Alzheimer's. Again, it just suddenly appeared in 1908. Then by 1948, it still wasn't that prevalent, only 150 people had it. Now, in 2023, 55 million people have Alzheimer's. So just by looking at these statistics right here, we can see that these are modern diseases. Originally, these things were called Western diseases because they were only in Western countries which ate this hyper-processed food. However, now they're known as modern diseases because all the countries eat the same food as us. So all of these diseases spawn in from nowhere. What could we blame? Maybe we could blame the one food that we've always eaten. That would be rather convenient for the food companies. But what does the data tell us? So 99% of our fats are coming from animal fats. Then as soon as the 20th century starts, we introduce something known as vegetable oil. And we start having more and more of this stuff. It's incredibly cheap to make. And as we see, the amount of it we have just increases monumentally. Now in the year 1980, it's when the first dietary guidelines came in that we should all reduce our fats. So that's what happened. Everyone started reducing their animal fats, but we continued to eat more and more of this vegetable oil. So as we see, the chart just goes up and up. Now, if we remember correctly, the first case of Alzheimer's was in 1908, and the first heart attack recorded in the United States was in 1912, which very coincidentally is when we started having this vegetable oil. Remember, before vegetable oil, zero of the stuff. And then all of a sudden our vegetable oil consumption goes like this, but it must be the one food we've always eaten, according to all these health experts. Now, red meat intake in the United States peaked in the 1970s, and since then the average American eats 44% less than they used to. However, as we've seen from all this data, the prevalence of all these diseases has continued to go up. To a lot of people, this data is going to seem incredibly confusing. They've been told their entire lives that red meat's bad. They see headlines about it all the time. How is it that we find in many studies that red meat's bad? Well, now I want to explain a concept to you known as healthy user bias. So how this works is they get two groups of people. They'll get a high vegetable group, a group of people that eats lots of vegetables, and they'll get another group of people, the low vegetable intake group. Now this low vegetable group, have a guess what they're eating? They're eating the gas station pies, they're eating the burgers on their way home from work, they're eating all of this ultra processed garbage. All of these foods which are made from chemicals with hundreds of ingredients, some of them. Now, even though I don't think eating plants are good for us, only an absolute idiot would argue that eating some friggin' broccoli and spinach is going to be anywhere near as bad for you as eating this ultra processed stuff with 100 different plants combined, many of which are put through these ultra processing processes where they heat the foods up to super high temperatures, extract some little oil, then they mix it with some chemical solvent. All of this stuff, like I said, it's basically chemicals. And so then what they'll do is they'll compare the health outcomes between the high vegetable group and the low vegetable group. And have a guess what they find? The high vegetable group does better than the low vegetable group. Wow, who would have thought that people eating foods with only one ingredient would be better for them than eating chemicals? This right here is called an observational study. So that's how they show that vegetables are good for you. But how do they prove that red meat is bad? Wow, it's basically the exact same thing. What they do is they get a group of vegans and a group of meat eaters, and then they compare health outcomes. Now, 30 to 60% of people go vegan due to health reasons. So these people are much less likely to smoke, they're much less likely to drink alcohol, and they're also much more likely to get enough sleep, avoid the ultra-processed garbage, and to do enough exercise. So they compare these vegans with the meat-eating group. But this meat-eating group, they're not strict carnivores. They include literally everything as meat. You had lasagna the other day? That's one serving of meat. You had a burger on your way home from some fast food joint? That's one serving of meat. You had a gas station pie? That's a serving of meat. And on screen right now, you can see the ingredients that are in some of these foods. Seriously, I just Googled gas station pie from a local gas station that's near me. Those are the ingredients. I searched up cheeseburger. I went on some big fast food company's website, and those were the ingredients. Now, these meat eaters, they're also seen as rebellious people. These people have been told for years that meat's bad for them, but they don't care. They're still eating it. So these people are also much more likely to smoke, much more likely to drink. Chances are they're not exercising, not getting enough sunlight, not getting enough sleep, these sorts of things. And so then again, they compare the two groups, the meat-eating group with the vegan group. And then have a guess what they find? The group of people eating foods with only one ingredient are healthier than the group of people eating all these ultra-processed chemicals. But then obviously, they're not going to blame the chemicals. They're going to blame the one food that humans have always eaten. That's what gets the blame for it. It's a great psyop, and the majority of people fall for it. I often get people commenting on my videos talking about how I'm giving people heart disease simply because I say to people, eat more red meat. Now, from these studies, you can print any headline you want in theory because the meat eating and chemical group, you just take the chemical part out, obviously that's what they do, has worse health outcomes than the vegan group. So from here, whatever you like. So you'll see some headline. The more fiber you have, the healthier you'll be. When in reality, it's the more fiber you're having, the less of this ultra-processed garbage you're having. Every single negative headline you've ever seen has come from one of these observational studies. Now, there's another type of study called an interventional study. Now, what they do here is they get a group of people and they completely change something up about their lifestyle. Now, what happens when you do this to people? I want to show you guys the Harvard study. Now, admittedly, there's a number of issues with this study. It's not perfect science. For one, there's self-selection bias. However, it's basically the only carnivore interventional study we have. And as you can see on screen right now, the results from the study are remarkable. And from memory, I think there was like over 2,000 people in the study, so it wasn't like it was a very small sample size either. Now, what about fiber? Don't we need it? Isn't it essential for human health? Well, let's have a look at the study together, in which they got 63 people with constipation and put them on 3 different types of diets. 41 patients were put on a no fiber diet, 16 on a reduced fiber diet, and 6 resumed their high fiber diet. Now, patients who stopped or reduced dietary fiber had significant improvement in their symptoms, while those who continued on a high fiber diet had no change. And the study concluded, constipation and its associated symptoms can be effectively reduced by stopping or even lowering the intake of dietary fiber. Who would have thought a species that's only eaten meat for at least hundreds of thousands of years can do alright when they don't eat plants? But this sounds insane. How is it that your local doctor doesn't know this? Well, the thing is that doctors aren't taught a lot about nutrition at medical school. They're just taught the basics like you need lots of fiber because every study we see where there's a high fiber group and a low fiber group, the high fiber group does better. And that red meat's bad for the exact same reasons. As we now know, this is due to healthy user bias, but they're not told this. In fact, I was watching a great video the other day from Paul Saladino when he went to a university and interviewed these med students and asked them how many interventional studies are there that show red meat being bad. Remember, interventional is the type of study where they completely change their diet and see the effects it has on them. And these students were convinced that there would be at least some. Paul even offered to give them $100 if they could find a single one, and nobody could. So in conclusion, there is zero actual evidence that red meat's bad for us. Every single study that's ever been presented that shows red meat being harmful for us is only an observational study which suffers from healthy user bias. There's only been one interventional study where they've put people on an all-meat diet, and the results from that study showed that when people ate a diet of only meat, their health transformed in a very positive way. Now, there are many doctors who have seen the truth and they're talking about it, and I highly recommend that you check out guys like Dr. Anthony Chaffee, Dr. Sean Baker, Dr. Ken Berry, but chances are if you're watching this video, you've already seen a lot of their content. There are 5 main arguments that people use to try and discredit the carnivore diet. Now, whilst all of these arguments have no credibility, it can be incredibly frustrating when someone questions you for your dietary choices and you don't have these answers. In today's video, we are going to break down these 5 arguments in the most simple and easy to remember way possible so that you have the answer next time someone tries to say to you that the carnivore diet is harmful. We are going to look at whether we actually do need fiber, whether cholesterol's a problem, the alleged phytonutrients that we can't get from meat, whether a lack of vitamin C will give us scurvy, and whether or not red meat rots in our gut and causes us bowel and colon cancer. So let's get into things. First, let's look at fiber. Your doctor may say to you, you need fiber for a healthy gut and to stay regular. Well, what's interesting is that the carnivore diet actually reverses IBS and gastrointestinal issues. Hundreds of thousands of people do the carnivore diet, and pending they're not eating incredibly lean and they're actually getting some fat in their diet, none of them get constipated. In fact, in a study of over 2,000 people on the carnivore diet done by Harvard University, 97% of people improved or resolved their stomach issues. Now, I'll be the first to admit, this isn't the greatest study ever done. There's a number of issues including self-selection bias. But when 2,000 people say that a certain diet improved their stomach issues, reversed their IBS, which for those who don't know, IBS stands for irritable bowel syndrome, and many people with IBS have constipation, it goes a long way to showing the credibility that we do not need fiber. The truth is, humans are a carnivorous species. We know this due to a number of reasons. First, we can look at our fossils from 12,000 years ago and prior, before we started agriculture. We have incredibly high nitrogen-15 ratings, higher than every other species on the planet. And how this works is the higher the nitrogen-15 rating, the more carnivorous a species is. We also have very acidic stomachs, like every other carnivorous species. And we also went through the Ice Age, meaning that the majority of plants were frozen over, so we literally had no choice but to eat meat. And what's interesting is all these other carnivorous species don't get constipated. They're not eating fire, but lions, wolves, they don't have stomach problems because they're a carnivorous species like we are. Herbivore species, on the other hand, who only eat plants, what they're able to do with fiber is they're able to ferment it, turning it into short-chain fatty acids. For us, when we consume fiber, it contains 0 calories, simply because we cannot break it down. While technically speaking, to a very small degree we can, but it's very minuscule. But for species like gorillas that are what is known as hind-gut digesters, they can ferment this fiber and turn it into short-chain fatty acids, which count as 2 calories. The same goes with cows, which are known as ruminant animals, which have these large multi-chambered stomachs. They can use their rumen, which is their largest stomach, to turn this fiber into short-chain fatty acids. But humans, we don't have any of these characteristics. We cannot absorb fiber. It binds to nutrients, preventing their absorption, as well as the fact that it just messes with our gut. Fiber causes issues for many people, and by simply reducing the amount of fiber you're consuming, many people see that their stomach issues greatly improve or completely resolve, as demonstrated by the Harvard study. Now, there's one concept that is super important for all of the points on this list, and that is what is known as healthy user bias. You'll often see studies saying that red meat is bad, or increasing the amount of fiber you're consuming is a good thing because we see improved health outcomes when this occurs. But here's what they'll do. This high fiber, low meat intake group they're eating primarily fruits and vegetables because that's where you get fiber from. They're not eating ultra processed foods because in ultra processed foods, they strip the fiber from these foods. And then the low fiber group, high meat intake group, have a guess what they're eating? They're eating the ultra processed garbage. They're eating pizzas on their way home from work. They're getting the gas station pies. They're eating all these low fiber meat foods, which, I mean, can you really call them meat if they're only a small percentage meat? And consequently, it affects their health outcomes. So they compare these two groups, the fruits and vegetables group with the ultra processed garbage group, and have a guess what happens. They find that increasing your fiber is good for you, that cholesterol is bad for you, that meat is bad for you. These studies are horrifically designed. There has never once been an interventional study showing that red meat is harmful in any way. And interventional studies are much more credible. Imagine we got these two groups of people and we got them on an all meat diet. That's the only way to see if red meat is truly the problem. How can you blame red meat for the problems caused by these emulsifiers, preservatives, all the other garbage they chuck in these things? The only evidence that shows fiber's a good thing or that cholesterol's a bad thing are from these studies that have this healthy user bias. So yeah, keep that concept in mind whilst we go through these points. Now let's look at cholesterol. There's a few paths you can go down regarding cholesterol. There are some studies showing that low cholesterol is worse for you than high cholesterol. But the problem with going down this route is there's so many conflicting studies on this topic, and it makes it much harder to conclusively prove your point. So in my opinion, the better argument is just to simply put it like this. The first heart attack was in the year 1912. Heart disease, as we know it, did not exist in the year 1900, and then by the year 1930, it became the #1 killer in the United States. Now, we've always eaten red meat, but hyper-processed foods, in particular seed oils, only really became a thing in the year 1905. So all you need to do is say this to your doctor and ask them the question, are you blaming all of these modern diseases that did not exist on the one food that humans have always eaten? Again, all the studies that show cholesterol bad are as a result of this healthy user bias that we talked about regarding fiber. What's interesting though is that cholesterol is incredibly essential. Our body produces a small amount of it. Our cells are made from it. If cholesterol is so toxic, why is our body naturally producing it? It's a precursor to many of our hormones, including testosterone. It's incredibly apparent when a man does not consume enough cholesterol. Another argument that some people have is that there are these alleged phytonutrients that we can only get from plants. Now this one's simple. You just ask them to name one. There is not a single nutrient that we cannot get from meat in sufficient quantities. If your entire diet is meat, you get every single nutrient you need in the perfect quantities. It's almost like humans have eaten this way for an extended period of time, and so over time we've become accustomed to getting this amount of each nutrient, and therefore our body continues to want that amount. But then they'll say on carnivore you won't get enough vitamin C, and you'll end up getting scurvy, like all these sailors allegedly did some time back. Now maybe these sailors did get scurvy, but they weren't eating fresh meat. In meat, there is more than enough vitamin C. Now, technically speaking, a carnivore diet doesn't meet the RDA for vitamin C intake, but there are a number of reasons for that. When you're consuming plants, you have lots of fiber. You have these defense compounds which act as nutrient blockers. I mean, fiber itself binds to nutrients, affecting their absorption, but many of the other defense compounds, such as tannins, also bind to these nutrients, which further prevents their absorption. So for one, because you're not consuming these other compounds that block the absorption of vitamin C, you're going to need a lot less, as well as the fact that vitamin C and glucose have a very similar molecular structure. And glucose is what carbohydrates break down into. Because they have this very similar molecular structure, compete for the same receptors to be absorbed. So you remove the carbohydrates and therefore you remove the glucose, and vitamin C is much better able to be absorbed. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have done the carnivore diet now, and there is not a single case of scurvy ever reported. And then there's the bowel/colon cancer argument. Allegedly, eating red meat will give you these things. Remember the healthy user bias that we talked about at the start? Again, this is a classic case of it. They'll get two groups of people, the vegetable group and the meat or more like ultra-processed group, and they'll monitor a large amount of them. Let's say 100,000 in each group. They'll track them for 5 years. And then, in the meat group, there'll be 2 people that get bowel cancer. And in the vegetable group, there'll be 1 person that gets bowel cancer. Now, you know it's a much better headline than saying 2 out of the 100,000 people from the meat group got bowel cancer, and only 1 person from the vegetable group got it? Well, you can just say, eating red meat doubles your chance of getting these diseases. And that's what they do. And all the normal people who, get their health advice literally from news headlines, they go around and repeat this. Eating red meat will give you bowel cancer. It doubles your risk. But in reality, that is just not the case. Again, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people on carnivore, and not a reported case of bowel cancer. If red meat was so bad for you, can someone explain to me how these people who have been on carnivore, some for as long as 60 plus years, don't have it? Alrighty, so let's break this down. Here are the researchers: Harvard Medical School professor, professor of nutrition at Harvard, as well as a couple of other people who weren't from Harvard, such as a dietitian at Boston's Children's Hospital and a biomed researcher from Louisiana State. There were 3,833 participants originally. A lot were excluded for various reasons. Vast majority were from United States and Canada, but we had people from all over the world, both male and females, all ages, all weights, various education, income. So we have a very diverse bunch of people. Now, all of these people had been on the diet for at least 6 months beforehand. Now, obviously, this study was a self-reported study for most of the metrics, but there are certain metrics like whether or not you came off your diabetes medication or whether or not your autoimmune condition improved that you can't really fake. So even despite the fact that these are self-reported findings, the results are very credible. These people have no reason to lie. They're not incentivized to lie. This is just a random study. They got a bunch of people, told them to try this diet. Let's see what happens. Now, these people ate a variety of different things. Only 85% of them consumed some sort of ruminant animal. As you can see, their diets were very diverse. A lot of people included dairy. Nearly half the people, 21% of people, used herbs and spices daily. The majority of people used high-fat meat, but there were some that used leaner cuts. Unless this 2% here are super overweight, I think going super lean for the entire time is highly concerning. Also, a combination of people eating grass and grain finished beef. 76% of people still drank a coffee at least once, and basically half still drank tea. And again, half the people consumed alcohol as well. So it's not like this is a super strict, they lock these people in a lab and only bring them grass-fed, grass-finished beef. This is a pretty loose carnivore diet, really. People having alcohol, tea, coffee, herbs and spices. Again, more people having wine. Even with these electrolyte supplements, be willing to bet that quite a few of these people who had the electrolyte supplements had some sort of sweetener. So it is important to note that even though this was a carnivore diet study, not everyone was completely strict, which may have an effect on the results, which is what makes this study even more impressive, as you're going to come to realize. Most people had 1 to 2 meals a day, and here's the levels of compliance. As we go down and down, we see more and more people cheated on occasion. However, despite the fact that most people every now and then slipped up, look at what happened to the diabetics. 100% of them came off injectable medications. 92% came off insulin completely. 84% off their oral medications. And a 90% improvement in all diseases with an average weight loss of 20 pounds. Again, even though the majority of people cheated, it goes to show how effective this diet is to have such incredible numbers. And again, as we go down even further, the results are seriously, seriously impressive. 95% of people overall improved health. 91% improved hunger and food cravings. 89% improved their energy, which, contrary to popular belief, even though these people went from high carbohydrate diets to low carbohydrate diets, 9 in 10 people saw an increase in energy. Mental clarity, 85% improvement. As we go down further, once again, 98% of people improved or resolved their diabetes issues. 97% of people resolved gastrointestinal conditions, which again, usually they say without fiber, going to get all bunged up, not going to be able to go to the bathroom, but here we see it's not quite the case in reality. Also, a vast improvement in psychiatric symptoms, autoimmune conditions, cardiovascular issues. What we also see that significantly improved is how 93% of people lost weight. Once again, the vast majority of these people were cheating. So to have such a high number, despite that, is seriously, seriously impressive. And again, usually people think, if you eat high fat, you're going to get fat. Time and time again, we see that's not the case. In total, 98% of people were very satisfied or satisfied with the diet. This study right here shows us exactly what we already knew anecdotally. Every single person I've ever met that's done this diet has been very satisfied with it. I think these people here that were only satisfied, or the 2% who just didn't like it, I think their problem was one, they're eating too lean, or two, they're cheating on the diet. Now, obviously, there are limitations based on self reported responses. As I mentioned earlier, these people have no reason to lie, and nearly every single study in the field of nutrition is self reported. It's very expensive to get people and to pay them to stay in the clinic for weeks and weeks. So the vast majority of the studies that people love to reference are self-reported. If you look at wild animals, you will notice something very interesting. They're never fat and they have very little of the human-like diseases that we have. However, when we domesticate these animals and feed them a diet that is not their species appropriate diet, what happens is they start to get all of our human-like diseases, including high rates of cancer, diabetes, and even heart disease. The average lifespan of a golden retriever used to be about 16 years. However, now it's only down to 10. And the reason for this is due to one factor, which I'm going to be discussing today. In today's video, I'm going to be breaking down why it is so important that a species eats its species appropriate diet. First up on the agenda today, I'm going to be breaking down what is a species appropriate diet, and then following with why is a species appropriate diet important. And then I'm going to look at examples of adaptations that species have when they eat their species appropriate diet, as well as what happens to a species when it's not eating this appropriate diet. Then finally, I'm going to be looking at how this concept applies to humans by breaking down what are humans meant to eat, followed by have humans adapted to be able to break down the defense chemicals in plants, and then how plants are detrimenting human health. What is a species appropriate diet? A species appropriate diet is what a species is designed to eat and what a species has always eaten. Now, for every wild animal, this can be put down to plain intuition. Lions aren't taught that they're meant to hunt other animals, they just intuitively do it. Cows aren't told they're meant to eat grass, they just intuitively do it. Sure, you could argue their parents have taught them this. However, even if you get a lion and take it away from its family, it will still hunt other animals. Dogs are the same. Another factor that influences what a species eats is the amount of access to food it has. For example, take chimpanzees. For a long time, chimpanzees were regarded as a herbivore species. However, in more recent years, they've been observed hunting other animals if given the chance. But why is a species appropriate diet so important? Well, when a species eats a certain plant for an extended period of time, they begin to develop adaptations to break down the toxins in that plant. And for those of you who are unaware, every single plant contains at least some toxins, including vegetables, by the way. Every single vegetable that humans commonly eat contains over 60 identified carcinogens. Now, for some people watching this video who have never heard of this concept, that's going to be hard to believe. However, this is completely true. Every single living organism has two main goals: to survive and reproduce. Now, animals can defend themselves through methods like kicking, biting, running, those sorts of things. However, plants are obviously stationary, but over time they develop something known as defense chemicals to deter insects, birds, or just predators in general from eating them. And this right here is why vegetables have such a bitter taste to us. It's our taste buds identifying that these things have toxins and that we shouldn't eat them. Let's take a look at some of these adaptations that certain animals have. First, we're going to look at gorillas. Now, gorillas are what is known as hind gut digesters, which means they're able to use their large cecum and colon to ferment plants, turning the fiber that they contain into short-chain fatty acids. For humans, when we eat fiber, it counts as 0 calories because for the most part we can't break it down. However, if a gorilla eats a gram of fiber, it counts as 2 calories because, like I just said, they can turn it into these short-chain fatty acids. Now, because of this and other factors, such as the fact that they have massive intestines, gorillas are able to eat certain plants without it having an effect on them, because during this fermenting process, many of the toxins in the plants that gorillas are eating are broken down. Another species that has had an adaptation because they've eaten a plant for an extended period of time is ruminant animals. Examples of ruminant animals include sheep and cows, and basically what a ruminant animal means is that they have 4 stomachs. And because they have this complex digestive system with their multi-chambered stomachs, they're able to break down the compounds in these plants that would harm other species. So if a species eats something that's not its species appropriate diet, they can't break down these toxins in plants, and it's going to have significant effects on them. An example of a species that eats something that it hasn't yet adapted to is pandas. The earliest pandas were carnivores. However, due to the fact that they could not get enough food from other animals, largely due to the fact that they're not the greatest hunters, pandas switched from a carnivorous diet to a diet of bamboo. Now, while pandas do have some very minor adaptations like a specialized gut microbiome, they have not yet fully adapted to eating this bamboo. They aren't hindgut digesters like gorillas, and they don't have the multi-chambered stomachs like cows. In fact, pandas still have a digestive system that's rather similar to other carnivorous species. And now I'm going to read to you some of the issues that are reported in pandas. Gastrointestinal issues, respiratory illnesses, low reproductive rate, immune issues as they age, and low energy. Now, this sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? Humans who are also eating a diet that is not their species appropriate diet seem to suffer from very similar issues. So, what is the species appropriate diet for humans? Well, it's very simple. Humans are designed to be carnivores. Now, have we consumed plants from time to time as survival foods? Absolutely. However, humans are designed to only eat meat. I have an entire video on this topic where I break down 31 reasons as to why this is the case. However, I'll break down a few of the most compelling reasons with you now. The first being the Ice Age. From about 2.5 million years ago to 12,000 years ago, humans lived in the Ice Age, which meant a large portion of Earth was covered in ice. And because the entire Earth was covered in ice, it meant all the plants were also. So humans had very little access to eating plants. Now, this is further supported by the fossils we find, as because in fossils there is something known as nitrogen 15 ratings. And how this works is the more carnivorous a species is, the higher their nitrogen 15 rating is. And humans had the highest nitrogen 15 ratings on the planet, higher than every other species, including all the carnivorous species like wolves. What's also interesting to note is the fossils that we find that are 12,000 years or older are in much better health than the ones we've found since then, since we started agriculture. As soon as this ice melted, humans started agriculture, and ever since then, based on our fossil records, our health has not been the same, which is another indication that we're not designed to eat plants. Now, these are only a few of the reasons that we know that we're meant to be carnivores. And like I said, I went into this in great depth in another video, which I'll link to at the end of this one. Now, in the last 12,000 years, as I mentioned, humans have started agriculture. So is that enough time for us to become adapted to plants? Now, for species to develop minor adaptations, it takes roughly 10,000 years. Now, this number is very different species to species due to something known as a life cycle. Now, humans have a life cycle of about 20 to 30 years, which means that on average it takes about 20 to 30 years for a new generation to start. Now, obviously, the shorter the life cycle of a species, the more new life they have, and the more new chances they have to develop these adaptations. And so for humans, it might even take us longer than this 10,000 year time frame due to the fact that we have a relatively high life cycle. So how do we know this time frame is accurate? Well, when we look at human fossils from about 10,000 years ago, they have very little of what is known as the LCT gene, otherwise known as the lactose gene, which basically means that 10,000 years ago, everyone was lactose intolerant. However, since then, due to the fact that we started farming at the same time we started agriculture, humans have been drinking, likely, a lot of milk. And so over time we've developed this gene, and now most people can drink lactose without any issues. And to further support this, when we look at human tribes that still live out in the wild who haven't started farming, and therefore their people have never consumed lactose, they have very small amounts of this gene. For a species to become fully adapted to break down a plant, it takes over 1,000,000 years, and humans have only been mass consuming plants for the last 12,000 years. So we're not fully adapted. This is why we see in humans that we don't have any adaptations to break down plants, and it's why all plants by themselves taste bad. That bit of taste is signaling to us that we can't break this down, it's going to cause harm to us. So what detriment is consuming plants having to humans? Well, we can clearly see this demonstrated throughout society. 50% of people nowadays get cancer. 10.5% of people have diabetes. And the amount of anxiety and depression is just off the charts. Cancer is cells growing abnormally due to inflammation. And when we eat these plants that are toxic to us and we don't have the adaptations to break it down, have a guess what happens? It's gonna cause inflammation. And the same with diabetes. Diabetes is caused because humans are not used to consuming mass amounts of carbohydrates. All carbohydrates come from plants, with the exception of a small amount that comes from the dairy and milk. And then anxiety and depression. A large factor is an imbalance in hormones due to inflammation. 90% of the serotonin that humans make is made in the gut. So when you're eating foods that you're not designed to eat and your gut's all inflamed, people tend to get depressed. Don't believe me? In a study of over 2,000 people on the carnivore diet, 96% of the people surveyed said that their psychiatric symptoms improved. Humans, like all species, if they eat what they're designed to eat, do not get sick and they do not get fat. In today's video, I'm going to break down everything you can expect to happen to you in your first 14 days on the carnivore diet. First on the agenda, we're going to look at exactly what will happen to your body when you start eating the proper human diet. And then I'm going to break down the tangible benefits you'll experience and exactly how long it will take to experience each of these. Now, full disclaimer from the start, for some people, the first couple of weeks on carnivore, whilst you're adjusting, can be somewhat difficult. But after this period, it becomes incredibly easy to stick to. You just feel so incredible, you have so much energy, all the other food you're eating beforehand no longer appeals to you. When you first switch to carnivore, all of your inflammation starts to disappear. When you eat the regular standard American diet with all these highly inflammatory foods, every cell in your body becomes damaged. Humans are the only species smart enough to create our own food, but we're also the only species dumb enough to eat it. So what happens is when people eat certain things like sugars, starches, or just any plant in general that humans are not meant to consume, all of our cells become inflamed. And our cells are responsible for carrying out every bodily function, including creating our energy. This is why the average person seemingly has no energy. Their cells literally cannot function properly. However, when you eat the proper human diet, this reverses. When your body isn't functioning how it should, it can't make adequate amounts of hormones like dopamine and serotonin, which are responsible for making you feel happy. So as the inflammation starts to clear, you're going to start to feel amazing. For the first time in your life, your body is functioning how it's supposed to function. The first thing you're going to notice is the weight loss. This is instantaneous. Right at the start, you're going to drop a lot of water weight because you're not having carbohydrates. For every gram of carbohydrates that you eat, your body stores 3 grams of water, as well as the fact that when your body's inflamed, all your hormones are dysregulated, which causes you to retain even more water. Now, in theory, the immediate weight loss that you'll have in the first couple of days is only water weight. However, when you hold water, it looks like fat, even though it's not actually fat you're losing. Because this water weight and inflammation looks so similar to fat when you store it on your body, you may actually notice visible changes within the first few days. Some people notice within their first week on the carnivore diet that they look visibly different. The carnivore diet, or the proper human diet as it should be called, is in my opinion the best diet in the world for weight loss. I talked about this in great detail in a video I made the other day, which I'll link to at the end of this video. For most people, you should lose anywhere between 4 and 10 kilograms on carnivore in your first month, assuming that when you're hungry, you eat to your full and you're not having excessive amounts of dairy. The next thing you're going to notice is superhuman-like energy levels. But how long does this take to kick in? Well, when you first start, your body needs time to adapt. When you eat the standard American diet, your primary fuel source is carbohydrates. But when you switch to a carnivore diet, your primary fuel source is fats. So during this time, you may experience something known as the keto flu. Now, the keto flu is exactly as its name suggests. In fact, whoever decided to name this really did not put much thought into it. Essentially, you're switching into ketosis, which is a fancy way of saying your body's now running on fats, and you experience flu-like symptoms whilst you're adjusting. Hence, keto flu. Now, some people don't experience this at all, but for others it can last up to 2 weeks. For me personally, I had a headache that lasted for about half an hour, and then I woke up the next morning feeling incredible. However, as soon as you get through this adaptation phase, you start to have unbelievable energy levels. Seriously, it's hard to comprehend the tangible energy difference that you feel. Before I started carnivore, I had the regular energy levels of any 20-year-old. They were pretty decent, but I seriously struggled to get up in the morning. However, since I've been on carnivore, now I wake up at 4 AM before my alarm goes off with an obscene amount of energy. I literally never get tired unless I'm seriously sleep deprived, and on days where I have nothing on, I want to work out all day. So as soon as you get through the adaptation phase, you're just going to feel incredible because all this inflammation clears and your cells can function properly, and therefore they can produce the amount of energy that the human body should. Another thing you'll start to experience within these 14 days is zero hunger. When you eat carbohydrates, it breaks down to glucose, which causes a spike in your blood sugar levels. Now the problem with this is when it comes crashing back down, it doesn't just stop at its baseline level. It goes below this baseline level. And what happens then is your body thinks that it's run out of fat. It literally thinks that you're going to die. This is why you get that hangry sensation about 3 to 4 hours after you eat some carbohydrates. Another reason you experience no hunger is because you become something known as fat adapted. Now, what I'm about to explain sounds like some serious bro science, but believe me, this is a real thing. When you eat carbohydrates, your body runs on carbohydrates. When you eat fats, your body runs on fats. Now, when you eat carbohydrates and you run out of carbohydrates, your body's not very effective at tapping into its own fat because it's not used to it. However, when you're fat adapted, meaning it's used to running on fats, guess what happens when you run out of fats that's consumed? It can very easily tap into your own body fat. So you literally never get hungry. When I first started the carnivore diet, I remember thinking to myself, geez, I don't seem to get hungry. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to see how long it takes for me to get hungry. Fast forward 2.5 days of not eating. I kind of got a bit bored and I was like, you know what? I want to eat something. But literally 2.5 days without any hunger. It's incredible. So as soon as you get through the adjustment period, you'll almost never get hungry. However, I did notice that as I got leaner and leaner, every now and then I'd get this almost like hunger-like feeling. It's not the classic hungry you're used to experiencing on the standard American diet. It's more like, my energy's a little bit low, and I reckon if I ate some food right now, my energy would increase slightly. But you're never truly hungry. Another positive that you'll notice in these first 14 days is that you'll start to feel less anxious. Like I explained at the start, when you eat inflammatory foods, it causes your body to become inflamed and just everything doesn't function how it should. Most people's guts are just destroyed from the poison they put in it, and your gut is responsible for making many of the hormones that make you happy and make you feel calm. For example, 90% of serotonin is made in the gut. Now, when people are depressed, they prescribe them a drug known as SSRIs, which's main purpose is to increase their serotonin levels. So when your gut goes from being damaged and therefore not able to make serotonin properly, to having all of this inflammation cleared and it working properly, you can only imagine how it's going to make you feel. So as soon as your gut starts to heal, you're going to notice your mood increases. Now, for some people, this literally happens in a couple of days. Now we're going to talk about some of the negative things you might experience. First up, stomach issues. When you first start the carnivore diet, you may get diarrhea. The main reason for this is that your body can't yet produce enough bile to break down the fat you're consuming. Now, when you start the carnivore diet, you're going to increase the amount of fat you're eating. However, for fat to be absorbed, it requires something called bile. Over time, as you consume more and more fat, your body also upregulates the amount of bile it makes so that this fat can be absorbed. However, at the start, before your body starts to upregulate the amount of bile it makes, a lot of the fat you eat just simply cannot be absorbed, so it goes straight through you. As well as the fact that your gut just needs time to adjust. If you were carnivore your whole life, and then you switch to a vegan diet, you would experience the same issue. Now, about 50% of people will experience this, and for most, it lasts no more than a couple of weeks. So please believe me when I say, for your first couple of weeks, you probably want to keep a bathroom nearby. And if you do experience this, please remind yourself this does not last for long. I remember when this happened to me, I nearly called it quits. I was driving on the highway with some woman I knew, and I remember thinking to myself, oh dear, this is not ideal. Luckily, my apartment was nearby and I managed to style off, pretending I had something important I need to grab. So I raced inside, and whilst I was sitting there reconsidering all of my life decisions up until this point, I nearly called it quits right then and there. Some people also experience constipation. Now, if you're truly constipated, this can literally be solved just by having more fat. However, do note that because you're not eating all this inflammatory garbage, your body just has a lot less waste. So a lot of people find that they need to use the bathroom a lot less frequently. It's not uncommon for people on carnivore to only go number 2 every 3 to 5 days. So if you haven't gone to the bathroom for a few days and you don't feel like you need to go, you aren't constipated. The next negative thing that some people experience is keto flu. So basically you might experience some flu-like symptoms like headaches, nausea for anywhere between 0 and 10 days. Some people don't experience this at all, and some people they struggle with this a bit. In order to mitigate symptoms for this, I recommend that you eat enough, eat till you're full, and to make sure you're putting a lot of salt on your meat. When you first enter a low carbohydrate state, your kidneys excrete more electrolytes. So make sure you're putting heaps of salt on your meat, way more than you usually would. The final thing you may experience in your first 14 days on the carnivore diet is cravings. Now, cravings are nothing more than a psyop from your brain. The processed foods that people eat nowadays are designed by teams of scientists to hit something known as the bliss point. Now, these scientists are incredibly good at their jobs. So what happens is you eat this stuff and you get tremendous amounts of pleasure from it, which releases a hormone known as dopamine. Now, humans are literally wired in a way to avoid as much pain as possible and to seek as much pleasure as possible. So your brain does whatever it can to feel pleasure. It does everything it possibly can to trick you into eating this stuff. And the worst part is that your brain always has the tactical advantage over you. It knows all of your weaknesses. It knows that there's this one food that you just really like, and that if it pops it into your brain, you'll want it so badly that you'll have it and it'll get its pleasure. The best thing about this is that after 2 weeks, your brain forgets how much dopamine it got from something. So if you can get through 2 weeks, you won't think about it again. This is why I get so annoyed with dorks online telling people the only way to get rid of your food addiction is to let yourself have it when you want it. It genuinely makes no fundamental sense. Why would you want to eat that stuff again to re-trigger the reward pathways? All you have to do is tough it out for 2 weeks and you'll never want that stuff again. Believe me, at one stage in my life, I considered myself a foodie. I love food very much. And when I first went on carnivore, I slipped off many times. However, now I don't even think about that stuff at all. In fact, I'm even at the point where that stuff genuinely repulses me. Like if I walk through the wrong aisle at the supermarket, I just start to get angry even looking at it. So all you have to do is win the mental battle for 2 weeks and you don't have to worry about these cravings again. For some people, you won't experience these at all, however. So you're on the carnivore diet and you're experiencing some stomach issues. Well, lucky for you, in today's video, I'm going to be breaking down why this is the case. Most people think that the reason they're experiencing diarrhea or constipation on the carnivore diet is because they're having too much or too little fat. However, there are a number of other reasons you may be experiencing these things. First up in today's video, I'm going to break down why you're having diarrhea and give you 9 possible solutions to fix it. And then I'm going to break down why you're constipated and give you 3 possible ways to resolve it. Why do we get diarrhea on the carnivore diet? Well, there's 3 main reasons. The first is that your body's making an insufficient amount of bile. For fat to be absorbed, it requires something called bile. Now, bile is made in our liver, stored in our gallbladder, and then released into our intestines to break down fat. When you first start the carnivore diet, you're going to drastically increase the amount of fat you're eating. However, it takes time for your body to upregulate the amount of bile it makes. So what ends up happening is you're consuming too much fat for the bile to break down, and it results in loose stools. As well as the fact that your gut microbiome is going through a drastic change. If you were a carnivore your whole life, and you switch to a vegan diet, you would have the same issues. When our gut microbiome goes through a drastic change, everything's just out of whack. All the bacteria and enzymes that are currently in our guts has to go somewhere, which again, this can cause loose stools. And then the final reason is that there's just a lot less bulking of your stool. And while this isn't a problem when you're only consuming meat and salt, but if you're still consuming things like coffee or artificial sweeteners, even if you are fine consuming them before carnivore, they may present a problem now due to the fact that there's just less matter in your stomach to absorb this stuff. And these things, they are laxatives. Coffee and sweeteners in some people do have laxative effects. Like I said, this third reason only applies to people who are still having things like coffee or artificial sweeteners. The first of the 9 ways you can resolve diarrhea is very straightforward. All you have to do is wait. For 90% of people, if you're experiencing diarrhea and you're within your first couple of weeks on the carnivore diet, the chances are you can change nothing, but in a few weeks' time, your body will have adapted and you'll no longer have this issue. So if you've just started the carnivore diet, when you watch this video, just keep all the other tips in mind, but you may not necessarily have to do anything. The next thing you might want to consider doing is eating less fat. Like I talked about earlier, your body requires bile to break this fat down, and at the start, the chances are your body hasn't had a chance to upregulate the amount it makes. So for some people, you may just be over-consuming fat. Cut the fat back a little bit and slowly over time, gradually increase your fat intake rather than just having massive increases at once. However, please remember you do need to consume a good amount of fat as it's very important for hormone function and just feeling good in general. The next thing you might want to consider is to consume less electrolytes. A lot of people when they go on the carnivore diet, they start consuming massive amounts of electrolyte supplements. You can get sufficient amounts of electrolytes in the meat you're eating as long as you're putting enough salt on your meat as well. Having a correct electrolyte balance in your body is very important. Too many electrolytes can be very toxic to your body. So if you're consuming way too many electrolytes, your body just does whatever it can to get rid of it. So often what will happen is you'll have loose stools as your body's simply just trying to get rid of the stuff. Another thing you might want to cut back on is the amount of hot rendered fat you're having. When fat is in a liquid state, it's much harder for our bodies to absorb, and especially at the start when you don't have much bile, it can just go straight through us. A lot of people find that even if they eat the same amount of fat, if they switch it from this hot rendered liquid fat to say like a tallow that's already hard, that their diarrhea just resolves itself. So that may be one thing you want to consider. I highly recommend if you're starting on the carnivore diet, you try not to have too much of this hot rendered fat and you opt for more of the fats that aren't in this liquid form such as tallow or even butter. The next reason is that you're actually not eating enough fat. Now how do you know if this is you? Well, you'll be having very infrequent but loose stools. So what happens is some people that just don't eat enough fat and just everything becomes clogged up because you need the fat to lubricate your stools. And so what happens is after a while of just being completely clogged up, you've got more stuff coming through and your body just doesn't want the stuff inside of it anymore. So it just flushes it out and yeah, it just results in diarrhea. Another thing to consider is dairy. Some people are just intolerant to lactose. Now lactose is a FODMAP, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it basically means it's a type of carbohydrate that is one of the main causes of digestive issues in humans. When you are lactose intolerant, it means your body is not making enough of the enzyme lactase, which breaks down lactose. And like I mentioned at the start, maybe you weren't lactose intolerant for most of your life, or you didn't think you were, because maybe you only had a slight lactose intolerance, but because on a regular diet you had much more bulking of your stool, you could kind of hide it. However, now on carnivore, because you're eating the proper human diet of only meat, there's nothing to bulk up your stool, and as a result, lactose may be posing a problem to you. However, again, this is probably very rare, and for most people, you're not going to have to cut out your dairy. Hey guys, it's me again. I wanted to let you all know that I've written an ebook, which is a complete beginner's guide on the carnivore diet. It's only 17 pages long, and it covers everything you need to know. So whether you want to refresh your knowledge, or you're a beginner who's looking to get onto the carnivore diet and doesn't know where to start, this one's for you.
All you have to do is head down to the description of this video, click the top link, and I'll send it to you for free. And on top of that, I'll send you a couple emails each week with some bonus tips I have regarding the carnivore diet. And the best part is that there's no catch. It's literally all for free. So go down to the description to claim your free copy now. Anyway, back to the video. Now the next thing you might want to consider is how much organ meat you're having. Now the reason for this is very similar to electrolytes, like I talked about earlier. Your body wants all of its vitamins and minerals to be in sufficient amounts. And for most of these things, your body doesn't want too many of them. Our liver is very high in vitamin A, and if you consume too much vitamin A, it's incredibly toxic for us. So our body will do whatever it can to get rid of this, and in some cases, this might be that it just passes it through you as quick as it possibly can and results in a loose stool. The next thing you might want to consider is how much water you're consuming, especially at meal times. When you drink too much water, it can literally just flush you out. A lot of people are under the assumption that the more water, the better. This is not the case. If you're thirsty, drink water. If you're not thirsty, you probably don't need it. The next thing you might want to consider is, are you really strict? As I talked about earlier, coffee and artificial sweeteners, as well as other things, can act as laxatives. When you are on a regular diet, there are a lot of things that you eat that just bulk up your stool and can mask these things. However, on carnivore, these can be a problem. So if you've been on carnivore for an extended period of time and you've tried all the other things that I've talked about in this video, it may be your coffee. Now, a lot of people who are having stomach issues on carnivore supplement with bile. And whilst I have seen comments of people talking about bile supplementation, there are a few things I want you to think about before you start consuming this stuff. The first is that when you have more bile, it means you're going to absorb more fat, which means you're going to be absorbing more energy. Now, a lot of people go on carnivore and one of their goals is weight loss. Do you want to be absorbing more of the energy, which gets stored as fat when you're trying to lose weight? I don't think so. As well as the fact that consuming bile from another species is just quite unnatural. The next thing we're going to talk about is constipation. A lot of people on carnivore think they're constipated, but they're actually not. To be constipated, you need to feel like you need to go to the bathroom, but you can't go. You can feel like your stomach's all full and that it just won't pass. When you eat only meat, there is just very little waste. Your body wants everything that it contains. It wants the nutrients, it wants the proteins, it wants the fat. When you eat plants, you have all these compounds that are just toxic to your body and it wants to get rid of them. Often people will go on the carnivore diet and they'll only go to the bathroom once every 5 days, once every 3 days, or something like that. This isn't constipation. If you don't feel like you need to go to the bathroom, you're not constipated. You just have less waste. All a stool is waste passing through your body. So for a lot of people who watch this video, you're not actually constipated. However, if you feel like you need to go to the bathroom, but you can't, and you just feel all blocked up, here is what's happening. You're either lacking fats, which provide lubrication, or you're lacking water, which prevents the stool from being dry and therefore being too firm. So let's talk about the 3 main things you can do to resolve constipation. The first is just to eat more fats. Like I said earlier, your body needs fat to lubricate the stool. So if you're not eating enough fat, everything's just going to be too still for it to pass through. So for the vast majority of people on carnivore, if you're truly constipated, you feel like you need to go, but you can't, increase the amount of fat you're eating and the chances are it will resolve itself. The next thing you might want to consider is the amount of electrolytes you're having. Electrolytes draw water into the intestines, which softens the stool up, as well as the fact that salt is responsible for your body storing enough water. So if you're not consuming enough salt, your body's just going to be dehydrated and therefore your stools are going to be too firm. Now, meat contains sufficient amounts of the majority of the electrolytes. However, for some people, the reason you may have constipation is because you're not putting enough salt on your meat. So if upping the amount of fat you're having doesn't work, the next thing you're going to want to do is increase the amount of salt you're having. And then the final thing you're doing is you might not be drinking enough water. Like I said at the start, your body needs water to prevent your stool from being too firm. So if the first 2 strategies don't work, try drinking a little bit more water. However, you don't want to go from drinking not enough water to way too much water, because when you drink too much water, it can deplete your electrolytes, which, as we just talked about, that can be another reason why you're constipated. In today's video, I'm going to be breaking down the 10 biggest mistakes that I see people making on the carnivore diet that ruins their results. Now, these mistakes usually lead to people not feeling as energized as they could be, or not achieving the weight loss results that they're after. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what to do on the carnivore diet and what not to do, and I can virtually guarantee that you will achieve all your goals. Now, admittedly, some of these tips are going to be controversial, in particular the final one, so I'm sure a few people will disagree with the things I have to say in this video. However, in my experience on carnivore and the countless other people who I've also worked with on carnivore, this is what works. The first and most common mistake that I see people make is that they don't eat enough fat. You see, people are scared of fat because fat sounds a lot like fat. People think that if they eat fat, it will make them fat.
This could not be further from the truth. Fat makes you feel full, and it's the building block for all of the hormones in our body. Humans never got fat until we started mass consuming things like sugars, other carbohydrates, these industrial oils, those sorts of things. Nobody ever got fat from eating animal fats. For fat to be absorbed, it requires something known as bile. Now, our bodies can only produce a certain amount of bile, and since we're not eating plants which contain things like fibre, which slows down our digestive system and gives our body more time to absorb all of this fat, even if you're eating an absurd amount of fat, your body can only absorb so much and it will just pass straight through you. Now, I'm not saying that you can have an unlimited amount of fat and not gain weight. However, if you do have low energy on carnivore, you want to up your fat intake. The second most common reason for people having low energy on the carnivore diet is that they're not having enough salt. On a low carbohydrate diet, your kidneys excrete more electrolyte, and salt is a combination of two electrolytes, sodium and chloride. What a lot of people seem to forget is the processed food that they used to eat contained a lot of salt. So what people will do is they'll cut out this processed food and cut out all the salt that comes along with it. And then because they're on carnivore, they also go into a low carbohydrate state. And then they'll still put the same amount of salt on their food as they normally would. Without enough salt, your body's not going to function properly and you're not going to feel your best. You need to put enough salt on. As Dr. Chafee says, add as much salt as tastes good. What happens is over time your body adjusts and you find yourself having less and less salt. Our bodies are incredibly intelligent, but at the start of the carnivore diet, you want to put way more salt on your meat than you usually would. If you're on carnivore and you don't have seemingly unlimited energy, the first two things you need to do is up your fat and up your salt. The third mistake that some people make on carnivore is that they don't read the ingredients of the things they're buying, and all these sneaky ingredients end up in their diets. Often people will buy things that they think are carnivore, like beef jerky, bacon, even sausages, and they won't check the back of the packets. Often these things are just filled with additives. Sometimes you'll even find these things are only like 70% meat. It's genuinely unbelievable how they can make these things 30% additives without anybody noticing it. Salt's another one of these things. You would think that salt would only contain salt. However, there's often things in salts like anti-caking agents to make sure that the salt grains don't stick together. So make sure that you're checking your ingredients thoroughly. The next mistake that people make is that they're including spices on their foods. Now I know when you go from a standard diet with plenty of variety to a meat-only diet, it can sound pretty daunting and you want to add flavor to your meat. However, when you don't have the stuff, your taste buds change over time. Seriously, to me now, a steak has so much flavor, it's unbelievable. I have no need to put seasonings on it because every time I take a bite, the amount of flavor it gives me is just incredible. And there's a very interesting paradox that you will experience if you continue to include these things on your meat, and that you actually have more chance of getting sick of the meat you're eating. Whereas if you only put salt on your meat, you'll end up never getting sick of it. I broke this down in a video I made the other day, so I'll play the clip from that, which explains exactly why this happens. So, why do we get sick of eating a food? When you think about it from a surface level perspective, it doesn't really make much sense that when we eat the exact same thing for multiple days in a row, that after we have it multiple times, we start to enjoy it less and less. Now the reason for this is because toxins like the defense chemicals in these foods start building up over time. Now let's look at an example of almond butter on toast. Let's say you had that for breakfast every single morning for a month. Why is it that after a month you start getting sick of it? One of the defense chemicals in almonds is literally cyanide, which has been used throughout history by assassins to poison people. So what happens is over time, as you eat more and more almond butter, more and more of the cyanide is going to accumulate in your body. And after enough times of being poisoned, your body's going to be like, whoa, 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 stop that. We don't want any more of the stuff. So it's going to send you a negative feedback mechanism in the sense that it's no longer going to taste as good. Now this applies to literally any food, even if you're just eating the toast by itself. Because wheat contains lectins, over time the lectins would build up, and so you'd start to get this negative feedback mechanism as well. Now because of this is why lots of people think that they want a diet with lots of variety. You often hear people say things like, oh, I could never do the carnivore diet, I like to have variety in my diet. It's like, yeah, of course, your body's being poisoned and it wants to eat something different. Of course you can't eat the same thing over and over when it's gradually tasting worse because your body wants you to stop eating it. Think about it, if you could eat your favorite food every single meal and never get sick of it, so that every single time you ate it, it tasted as good as it ever has, you would no longer have this desire for variety. How do we never get sick of eating something? It's very simple. You just eat fatty meat. When you start to eat this fatty meat over and over again, your body's quickly going to realize that there's no toxins in it. It has every single nutrient you need in the perfect quantities, and that you just feel amazing in general after eating it. And so because you're not getting this build-up in toxins like you would if you're eating some sort of plant, you're never going to get sick of it. Seriously, after a week or two, your taste buds will adjust massively, and meat will just have so much flavor you won't want anything else. The next mistake that people make is that they compare their results to others. People will see that their friend Jenny has gone on carnivore and lost 10 pounds in her first 2 weeks. However, everyone's bodies are different. A lot of people who are on the standard American diet before they went on carnivore have a lot of inflammation. Every cell in their body is decimated and their bodies need to heal. As well as the fact that many people are incredibly deficient in many nutrients before they start carnivore. So what happens is they go on carnivore and their taste buds are exposed to this nutrient-dense food. And so what happens is their bodies just want to keep eating the stuff. Some people when they first go on carnivore, because of this, end up gaining weight. An interesting example of this is Steak and Butter Gal, who when she first went on the carnivore diet, she ended up gaining like 30 pounds pretty quickly. Now she's lost all of it, but the reason for this is that she was a vegan for a long time beforehand, so her body needed a lot of meat so it could regulate all of its nutrient levels to where they need to be. Over a long enough time horizon, when you eat the proper human diet, you will look exactly how a human's meant to look. Every single species that eats its species appropriate diet does not get fat, does not get sick. Assuming you're not eating an absurd amount of dairy or something like that, all you need to do is give it time and trust the process. The next mistake that some people make is that they start off too strict. You'll often hear carnivore YouTubers, including myself, talk about how ruminant meat is the best type of meat. And this is completely true, it's the most nutrient-dense type of meat, and because their digestive systems are so complex, it means that no matter what they're fed, they're able to break it down, and it ends up in them having zero toxins in their meat. However, when you start the carnivore diet, if you're used to eating a diet with a lot of variety, it can make it very hard to stick to at the start if you're only eating one thing. So make sure you include whatever meats you want. If you want chicken, have chicken. If you want ostrich eggs, have ostrich eggs. If you're feeling like a steak, have a steak. It's completely up to you. What you will find, however, is that over time, as your body gets more and more rewarded for eating this ruminant meat, because like I said, it contains the most nutrients and it has the least toxins in it, and it will just make you feel amazing in general, is your body will recognize that it's doing this to it, and you'll start to crave it more. Most people find that after a few months on carnivore, the only type of meat they want to eat is ruminant meat. However, at the start, let yourself eat whatever you want. The next mistake people make is that they quit too early. When you first go on the carnivore diet, your body needs to make a lot of changes. For one, you're changing your primary fuel source from carbohydrates to fats. Your gut microbiome is going to change entirely, simply because it's curated based on exactly what you eat. So if you completely change your diet, your gut microbiome is going to change drastically. Now these things take time to adjust to. So if in your first couple of weeks your energy levels are a bit meh and you have some stomach issues, all you need to do is give it time. Over time these things will resolve themselves and you'll feel incredible. The next thing you want to make sure you avoid is boredom eating. Carnivore diet is one of the only diets in the world where you can achieve the body of your dreams without being hungry once. However, if you're one of those people who just eats every single time they get bored, it will halt your weight loss. The very simple philosophy on the carnivore diet is if you're hungry, eat a big meal till you're comfortably stuffed. As long as you're doing that, you'll notice that the pounds come off. However, if every time you get remotely bored, you sit down and have a massive meal, it may halt things. The next mistake people make is that they take supplements. Every single nutrient you need in the perfect amount is available in meat, including vitamin C. It's because when you're in a low carbohydrate state, you need a lot less vitamin C. Vitamin C and glucose, which carbohydrates break down to, have a very similar molecular structure, so they compete for the same receptors. So like I said, when you're in this low carbohydrate state, you need a lot less of it, and in meat there is plenty. Often I'll have people ask me if they should continue supplementing with some random pill. Why? Most of these vitamin supplements come from plants, so they have poor bioavailability. We literally cannot break it down. Not to mention the fact that the cases these things are made in are just filled with garbage ingredients. Meat is nature's multivitamin. As long as you're eating enough meat, it gives you every single thing you need. The only thing you should even think about supplementing with is electrolytes. But for most people, as long as you're having enough salt, you don't need to supplement with electrolytes. On carnivore, I work out for about 3 hours a day, simply because I just love it. It makes me feel amazing. I sweat an absurd amount, and I never get cramps. For the vast majority of people, meat, salt, water is all you need. The final mistake I see people make is that they get caught in this primal meat and fruit lifestyle. Humans ate a lot less fruit over time than you think they did. For one, we had the Ice Age, where from about 2.5 million years ago to 12,000 years ago, the majority of the planet was frozen over and we couldn't access the plants because they were frozen. As well as the fact that when we look at something known as the nitrogen 15 ratings in our fossils, we have very, very high ratings, higher than every other species on the planet. Now what this indicates is that the more carnivorous a species is, the higher this rating is. If we're eating an absurd amount of fruit, like 300 grams of sugar per day, like some people advocate for, there is no way this rating would be that high. Not to mention the fact that fruit is not real anymore. I made an entire video on this topic yesterday, but ever since we've started farming about 12,000 years ago, when the Ice Age finished, We've been crossbreeding our plants so they can get more of these favorable traits. Fruit nowadays is just so sweet, not in its natural levels like it was before we started messing around with this stuff. I've heard Kerry from Homestead Hell refer to fruit as genetically modified candy at this point, and I completely agree. And to make matters worse, in recent years, we've even started doing this stuff in labs. Literally, scientists will get a fruit, copy one of its genes, and paste it into another fruit. So they get more of these desirable traits, they become sweeter, and become more pest resistant. And when something is more pest resistant, it just means it's more defended. So it's going to contain more of these defense chemicals that we don't want. If you saw your favorite fruit in its original form, you wouldn't even recognize the stuff. Now, a meat and fruit diet is obviously a lot better than the standard American diet, but the optimal, true, primal, proper human diet is a carnivore diet. Anyway, that concludes the 10 biggest mistakes that I see people making on the carnivore diet.
One of the biggest problems people have with the carnivore diet is that they get sick of meat and want to eat something else, and as a result, they slip off the diet. So in today's video, we're going to address just that. First, we're going to have a look at why we get sick of something, and then I'm going to break down what you can do so that you never get sick of meat again. If you don't know who I am, my name's Max German. I'm an online fitness coach who's helped hundreds of people lose weight with the carnivore diet. So, why do we get sick of eating a food? When you think about it from a surface level perspective, it doesn't really make much sense that when we eat the exact same thing for multiple days in a row, that after we have it multiple times, we start to enjoy it less and less. Now the reason for this is because toxins like the defense chemicals in these foods start building up over time. Now let's look at an example of almond butter on toast. Let's say you had that for breakfast every single morning for a month. Why is it that after a month you start getting sick of it? One of the defense chemicals in almonds is literally cyanide, which has been used throughout history by assassins to poison people. So what happens is over time, as you eat more and more almond butter, more and more of the cyanide is going to accumulate in your body. And after enough times of being poisoned, your body's going to be like, whoa, 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 stop that. We don't want any more of the stuff. So it's going to send you a negative feedback mechanism in the sense that it's no longer going to taste as good. Now this applies to literally any food, even if you're just eating the toast by itself. Because wheat contains lectins, over time the lectins would build up, and so you'd start to get this negative feedback mechanism as well. Now I'm sure there's at least one person watching this video and thinking to themselves, there's no way that's actually it. How could our taste buds be that smart? Well, I want you to think about this. When you have a massive meal and you eat to the point where you're completely full, you're borderline feeling sick and you just cannot put any more in your mouth because the food tastes so disgusting. If we didn't have such incredibly sophisticated and complex taste buds, why is it that this food that tasted amazing 10 minutes ago is now tasting horrible? Our taste buds can literally change in the span of 10 minutes to stop us from overeating. So if we're getting a massive buildup of a certain toxin, of course they're going to change so we stop consuming this. Now because of this is why lots of people think that they want a diet with lots of variety. You often hear people say things like, oh, I could never do the carnivore diet. I like to have variety in my diet. It's like, yeah, of course, your body's being poisoned and it wants to eat something different. Of course you can't eat the same thing over and over when it's gradually tasting worse because your body wants you to stop eating it. Think about it, if you could eat your favorite food every single meal and never get sick of it, so that every single time you ate it, it tasted as good as it ever has, you would no longer have this desire for variety. How do we never get sick of eating something? It's very simple. You just eat fatty meat. When you start to eat this fatty meat over and over again, your body's quickly going to realize that there's no toxins in it. It has every single nutrient you need in the perfect quantities, and that you just feel amazing in general after eating it. And so because you're not getting this build-up in toxins like you would if you're eating some sort of plant, you're never going to get sick of it, assuming you don't do these next two things that I'm going to talk about. The first thing you need to do is avoid putting seasoning on your meat. You see, all of these spices are toxic to us and they contain a number of defense chemicals. The easiest way you can see this for yourself is if you eat some of it by itself. When you eat something individually, if it tastes bitter, if it doesn't taste good to you, that means your body is giving you a negative feedback mechanism and it's not good for you. So what will happen if you put these spices on your meat is that over time, the defense chemicals in these spices will build up in your system. And so as I talked about earlier, it's going to start tasting worse and worse. However, because you're having this on your meat, it also means that your meat is going to start tasting worse and worse. So what will happen is people will think, oh, I'm just sick of eating meat, when in reality it's your body telling you to stop putting spices on it. Now this can literally be something as simple as pepper. I had a client once who told me he was getting sick of eating beef. So I said to him, well, how are you cooking it? What are you doing with it? And he told me that he was putting pepper on. So I just said to him, stop putting pepper on it. And guess what? It's been months now, he's still on carnivore, and he loves his steaks more than ever. Now another thing these spices are going to do is mess with our taste buds. Because these spices just have so much flavor to them, especially like the spicy ones and stuff like that, because when we eat meat and it has a much more subtle taste, it's just going to seem like meat has a lot less flavor than it actually does, due to the contrast in taste between the spices and the meat. So if you are putting spices on your meat, I highly advise you take them off, and you will find that over time, just a regular steak with a bit of salt on it starts tasting better and better to you. Hey guys, it's me again. I wanted to let you all know that I've written an ebook, which is a complete beginner's guide on the carnivore diet. It's only 17 pages long and it covers everything you need to know. So whether you're a seasoned carnivore who wants to refresh their knowledge or a beginner who's looking for somewhere to get started, this one's for you. All you have to do is head down to the description of this video, click the top link, and I'll send it to you for free. And on top of that, I'll send you a couple emails each week with some bonus tips I have regarding the carnivore diet. There's a no catch. It's literally all for free. So go down to the description to claim your free copy now. Now the next tip to never get sick of eating meat is to avoid going off carnivore if you can. Especially with things like ultra processed foods and even things like fruit which have been genetically modified to be ultra sweet. Again, as I talked about earlier, due to the massive contrast in taste between these things, the subtle flavour of the meat isn't going to be quite as appealing. So every time you go off carnivore and your taste buds get exposed to this massive amount of flavour, it's going to make the taste of meat slightly worse. So when you're not messing your taste buds around and they're in more of their, I guess you could call it, natural state, meat is just going to start tasting better. Literally, every single steak I eat just tastes amazing to me because my taste buds aren't wrecked by eating these other things. And as well as the fact that my body recognizes that eating the stuff is just going to make me feel amazing and it's going to give it everything it needs. So it continues to send me more and more positive feedback mechanisms in the sense that it tastes better and better. So yeah, literally, the trick is to just eat fatty red meat with salt on it and do it over and over again until you start getting these positive feedback mechanisms, and then you'll never want to eat anything else because the steak just tastes so amazing. Like I said, I don't even have the desire to eat other foods because steak just tastes so incredible to me now. Literally, I feel so lucky and so blessed to be able to eat my favorite food on the planet for every single meal. Now this might sound ridiculous and you might think I'm lying to you, which you definitely should not think because I could not imagine someone going on the internet and not telling the truth. I don't think that's ever happened in history before. But if you do think I'm lying to you, go and ask any other long-term carnivore and they will tell you the exact same thing. So yeah, that basically breaks down why you don't get sick of eating meat on the carnivore diet. The carnivore diet is undoubtedly the best diet in the world if you're looking to drop some body fat. And in today's video, I'm going to break down the 9 reasons as to why I think this is the case. The first reason is that your metabolism increases. Now it sounds like a pretty outrageous claim that a diet can increase your metabolism, but hear me out. Most people who eat the regular standard American diet eat a diet full of highly inflammatory foods. Now when you eat these foods, every single cell in your body just becomes decimated. They become so inflamed that they cannot produce the same energy they usually would. There are so many people that will go to work, sit at a desk all day, and then afterwards they don't even have the energy to do anything physical. When you eat the proper human diet in the carnivore diet, all your cells are able to heal and consequently they can produce a lot more energy. Because of this, something known as NEAT increases. Now NEAT stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And to put it simply, this basically means all the little things you do all day. When you talk to someone, are you moving your arms around? When you're sitting at your desk, are you tapping your leg? Now this may sound very inconsequential, but over the course of the day, this can add up to 1,000, even 2,000 calories in some studies. You will genuinely be amazed at how much you notice your NEAT increases when you go on this diet. Like literally, I'll be at the gym and I'll catch myself pacing up and down in between sets simply because I have so much energy. I don't even realize I'm doing it, but I just can't stand still. There are so many people who are on this diet, and even though on paper they're eating more calories than they've ever eaten before, they still manage to lose weight. Now I'm not saying this diet has some magical properties where you can just eat as much food as you want and still lose weight. However, as I go through these next 8 points, you're going to slowly start to understand how it's very hard to overeat on the carnivore diet. The second reason is that one of your hormones called leptin works properly. The purpose of leptin is to signal to your body that you're full, so you stop eating. But here's the thing, whenever you eat a carbohydrate, your blood sugar elevates. And another hormone known as insulin also elevates to bring your blood sugar back down. As soon as insulin is activated, your leptin signaling is blocked, so your brain can't register that you're now full. This is why you'll eat a massive meal, you'll feel incredibly full, and then you'll eat some ice cream, and all of a sudden you'll be hungry again. The third reason is that you become something known as fat adapted. Most people have a diet high in carbohydrates, and when your primary fuel source is carbohydrates, your body runs on carbohydrates. Then what happens is because your body's used to running on carbohydrates, it's not very effective at running on fat. So as soon as you run out of calories from the food you've eaten, your body cannot tap into its own body fat and you become incredibly hungry. This is why all the people who try and count their calories and keep their carbohydrates high always seem to get incredibly hungry when dieting. Now let's compare that with someone who is fat adapted. When your primary fuel source is fat, your body starts to run on fat. And so when you run out of calories you've eaten, your body can easily tap into its own body fat. Now, if you talk to anyone who's on the carnivore diet, they will tell you they can literally go all day without eating. They seemingly never get hungry. However, if you're on a higher carbohydrate diet, you're going to notice you get hungry every 3 or 4 hours, and then it's just not going to be a pleasant experience overall. The fourth reason is that you won't have any blood sugar crashes. When you eat carbohydrates, your blood sugar rises, as I mentioned earlier. Problem with this is that it comes crashing back down, and it doesn't just stop at its baseline level where it was beforehand, it crashes below that. And the problem with this is when your body's in this state, it literally thinks it's dying. It thinks it's run out of fat, and that if it doesn't eat soon, you're going to be in serious trouble. This is why even super obese people on a regular diet, even just 3 to 4 hours after eating, get super hangry and feel like they need to eat. When you're on carnivore, you don't get these crashes, which is another reason as to why you don't get hungry. The fifth reason is that it's just a better version of the ketogenic diet. Now, the ketogenic diet scientifically is the most effective diet in the world. Out of all the diets in the world that have been comprehensively studied, on average, the person that goes on the ketogenic diet loses more than any other. Now, the carnivore diet hasn't had any proper long-term weight loss studies, but I'm going to break down how exactly it's just a better version of the ketogenic diet. The biggest issue with eating on a keto diet is that you still eat so many foods that wreck your metabolism. On the ketogenic diet, you can eat any food as long as it's low in carbohydrates. Now, for starters, most people on the keto diet eat a lot of vegetables. And as we know, all plants are defended, which means they're going to have all these defense chemicals, which is going to cause inflammation, slow our metabolism down, slow our NEAT down. And as a result, we're just going to be burning less calories overall. And that's not even the worst part. All these keto companies have taken things a step further. If you go to your local supermarket nowadays, you'll see things like keto pancakes, keto waffles. And sure, you can look at the back of the packet and it says no carbohydrates, but it still has about 43 ingredients, most of which are man-made chemicals. Seriously, you tell me what an emulsifier is made from. What are these preservatives made from? I'll tell you, it's an extract from some random plant that humans have never eaten, and then they put it through about 5 different processes, degumming, heating it up, cooling it, like genuinely, it is insane how they make some of these things. It's going to riddle your entire body full of inflammation, slow your metabolism right down, and as a result, you're just going to burn a lot less calories. Sure, on paper, you might be consuming the same amount of calories, but if one person's consuming all these keto waffles, and as a result, all their cells are just destroyed, they have no energy, they sit there all day, can barely get through the emails, and then you compare that to someone who's only eating meat, eating a proper human diet, and seemingly has unlimited energy. They're live wire, they're talking with enthusiasm, using their hands. At lunchtime, they have so much energy, they decide that they're going to go for a walk around the block. All these things add up massively. Anyone who tells you that all calories are the same either has very low intelligence or they're a sellout. Now, don't get me wrong, I still think a keto diet is better for losing weight than just your regular person who's counting calories on a high carbohydrate diet. However, the carnivore diet is just 10 times better. Reason number 6 is that you're just eating the proper human diet. And when you eat like a human, you look like a human. Literally, 200 years ago, if someone was fat, they would be in a circus. It was weird. If you look at pictures from 50 to 100 years ago, there was virtually no one that was fat. All you have to do nowadays is go to your local mall and you'll see that this is definitely no longer the case. Humans by design are not meant to be fat. So when you eat the proper human diet, your body just naturally regulates itself and you sit at a good, healthy body weight. Even if you're not counting calories, you just simply eat fatty meat when you're hungry, you're going to lose weight. The 7th reason is that eating meat is just incredibly satiating. In red ruminant meat, there's every single nutrient you need in the perfect quantities. Not to mention, like we said earlier, you're not eating carbs, so your hunger signaling is not being destroyed. If you eat a massive steak, say 1,000, 1,500 calories, chances are you're going to be pretty satiated. However, if you ate that exact same amount of calories on some regular standard American diet food, after a few hours, when your blood sugar comes back down, you're going to be starving again and you're going to want another 1,500 calories. Whereas the person who's had their calories in meat, they don't have to eat again till dinner. The problem with counting calories is that to a lot of people, on paper it sounds so good. They sell it to you that you can eat whatever food you want. And I say food in quotation marks because is that ultra processed stuff really food? I mean, it doesn't provide us with any nutrients. And when you eat it, you're hungrier after you've finished eating it than you were beforehand. So I don't even know if it really is food. But anyway, for the sake of this video, let's just say it is food. What happens is that you just keep cutting your calories down lower and lower and lower. But you're not fat adapted, you're getting these crazy blood sugar spikes. So what happens is at some point you just get incredibly hungry. Now sure, you can willpower your way through it, but many people have lives to live. It's definitely not ideal when you're hanging with friends or you've got an important meeting coming up and all you can think about is food. As you're dropping your calories, because you're becoming more and more inflamed from eating this poison, your metabolism's also dropping. So you get to the point where you're eating virtually nothing, but you have no energy, so you're barely burning anything also. Eating meat is just the most satiating food on the planet, and by only eating it, it's going to make it so much easier to achieve your weight loss goals. Reason number 8 is that it cures everyone's food addictions. Now, for a lot of people, this is the reason they can't lose weight. Some people often eat over their calories, not even because they get hungry, simply just because they love eating so much. Now, the reason for this is because these food companies literally have teams of scientists working hard to create the perfect food to hit something known as the bliss point. Now, what the bliss point is the perfect ratio of sugar, salt, and fat. And when your body gets this, it gives your brain so much dopamine. And for those of you who don't know, dopamine is a hormone that makes you feel amazing. Basically, human psychology 101 is seek pleasure and avoid pain. And because this food just gave your brain so much pleasure, all it can think about is getting it again. This is why so many people consider themselves foodies. They just get so much dopamine from the stuff that they can't stop thinking about it. And then they identify someone and base their personality around someone who just loves food. When you go on the proper human diet, you just start to enjoy food. When you're hungry, you go, you know what? A steak sounds good, and you eat it. And the more steaks you have, the better it tastes. But at no point do you become addicted to steak, where it's all you can think about all day. And this, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated reasons as to why the carnivore diet is so effective. The thing with the carnivore diet is that your taste buds change so drastically over time that meat just starts tasting better and better. If you're on the fence about whether or not you should do the carnivore diet, I highly recommend it. It's changed so many people's lives, including mine. I always thought that to get super lean, to have the body of my dreams, that I had to completely suffer.
In today's video, we're going to be breaking down the differences between doing a high-fat carnivore diet and a high-protein carnivore diet. This video is going to be one of my more controversial videos because my opinion on this actually differs slightly from many others in the carnivore community. And I think a lot of people are having their carnivore results held back due to some slightly misguided advice. So let's go through the role of each of these things. When we consume protein, it is broken down into amino acids, which essentially act as the building block for everything in our body. They're required for the creation of cells, repairing our muscle tissues. Protein is an incredibly essential nutrient. Excess protein not used for these functions can sometimes be converted into glucose through a process known as gluconeogenesis. And this right here is why a lot of people who have a very high protein carnivore diet aren't actually in ketosis. Some often overlooked functions of protein include the creation of hormones. Hormones like insulin and growth hormone are actually made from protein. Protein is also a very important aspect of satiety, or feeling full. There is a famous hypothesis called the protein leverage hypothesis, which essentially states that the reason humans are hungry is because we haven't consumed enough protein, and that as soon as we hit the required amount of protein we need, we will no longer be hungry. And whilst I don't 100% agree with this, because I think our satiety is much more complex than that, and it involves how much of each individual nutrient have we consumed, I still think that the protein leverage hypothesis does hold some weight. So as we can see, we need protein, we need a lot of it, and that is another reason why the carnivore diet is so effective, because by default, just by eating a lot of meat, we consume a lot of protein. Now we're going to look at the other essential nutrient, fat. Notice how I said other. Carbohydrates are the only macronutrient that humans do not need. When we consume fats, they're broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Fats themselves do not directly raise our blood sugar levels, which is another key component of consuming fats. If we were to consume a steak that was very lean and only had protein, we would have more of a blood sugar spike than if we consumed a fatty steak. Like protein, we need fats to create our cells and to create our hormones. They are also required for the absorption of many nutrients. Certain nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K are fat-soluble nutrients, meaning for them to be absorbed, they must be consumed at the same time as fats. Fats are incredibly important for satiety. Many people think that by eating fat, it will make them fat, when in reality there's this interesting paradox that if we don't consume enough fat, we're never going to feel full, which will cause us to eat more and then we'll get fat. So by looking at just some of the functions of each of these nutrients, we can come to a pretty concrete conclusion that we need to consume both of them and a substantial amount of them in that. Now, what would happen if you had a very high protein diet with not much fat? Let's look at that. For starters, you would feel terrible. You'd have virtually no energy. Like I talked about, we need these fats to create many of our essential hormones, as well as the fact that, well, fat is obviously the best source of energy. Now, if you are super overweight, you can kind of get away with this to some degree, because your body will tap into its own body fat for some of the things it needs. However, what you will find is that over time, as you start to lose weight and get leaner and leaner, is that when you don't eat a lot of fat, you just start to feel terrible. I personally noticed this. When I started carnivore, I wasn't consuming that much fat. I was peak bulk which basically means I was fat. And so even though the majority of the meat I was eating was pretty lean, I didn't seem to notice too many issues. However, as I started getting leaner and leaner and had less body fat to draw from, if I went 1 or 2 days of only eating leaner cuts of meat, I'd get this weird sensation. I can't really describe it, but it was just like my head kind of felt tight almost. And intuitively, I could just tell it was my body asking for more fat. I've also heard of other people experiencing the sensation. Let me know down below if you have. Now, what would happen if you did the complete opposite? You had lots of fat and very little protein. Well, for starters, I can't imagine your stomach would be doing too well. For fat to be absorbed, it requires something called bile, and our body can only produce so much bile. So if you're eating an absurd amount of fat and your bile hasn't upregulated that high, what's going to happen? Well, you can't break the fat down, it's going to end up in your stools and you're going to have loose stools. And then the other problem you're going to have is that you're not repairing your muscle tissues, and therefore you're not going to have any muscle mass, which will end up in you looking like the typical vegan. And you're also going to be incredibly hungry, like we talked about with the protein leverage hypothesis. So, now you know what to do. You know, not going to have too much protein and not enough fat, and I'm not going to have too much fat and not enough protein. But what is the ideal amount? Well, for sedentary individuals, you want to consume around 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. This amount right here is where you'll be satiated and it will give your body more than enough protein to carry out its necessary functions. And then for active individuals, you want 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per pound of body weight. And then after you've hit that amount, you want to get the rest of your energy from fats. I can't give an exact number because people just have very different lifestyles. I think a good place to start though is a 1-to-1 ratio. But when I say this, please remember that in 100 grams of lean muscle meat, there is 20 grams of protein. But in 100 grams of fat, there is 100 grams of fat. A lot of people make the mistake when you say a 1-to-1 ratio, and they assume from this that 1 pound of muscle meat means they need to eat 1 pound of fat. If you do that, believe me, you're going to spend your entire life in the bathroom. Do not do that. When I say a 1-to-1 ratio, it means 1 kilogram of muscle meat and 200 grams of fat. This right there will result in you getting 200 grams of protein and 200 grams of fat. Now, I said at the start of this video I have a controversial take on this topic, and that take is that for many individuals, I think having a super high fat carnivore diet may actually be detrimental. There is this notion amongst the carnivore community that you can eat unlimited amounts of energy and be absolutely ripped, which I just do not fundamentally believe to be true. And I've seen Sean Baker talk about this topic, who has the exact same perspective as me. I've gained weight on carnivore when bulking up, eating only steak and eggs. Sean Baker's gained weight on carnivore, eating only steak. Mark Bell's gained weight on carnivore, eating only steak. Now, for the three of us, we were intentionally eating a lot of steak in order to bulk up and gain some muscle mass. But these examples right here prove you can only eat steak and gain weight. A lot of people say that because you're not spiking your insulin, your body can't store fat. However, like I talked about at the start, when we consume protein, our insulin spikes at least to some degree, which means that we can store it as fat. We can also think about this from a purely logical standpoint. For hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, humans exclusively ate meat. Now, if we couldn't store any of this meat as fat because our insulin allegedly isn't being spiked, how are we still around? We would have all died of starvation. If this was true, why isn't every single person on the carnivore diet 7% body fat whilst eating 10 meals per day? A very high fat carnivore diet is great for people whose sole goal is to heal, as the super high amounts of fat mean they're going to constantly be in ketosis, which is incredibly advantageous for a lot of conditions. However, if your goal is to look absolutely ripped, like you're from a movie, you walk down the beach and everyone's staring at you, I do honestly believe you need to lower the fat at least to some degree. You definitely don't want to go too lean, as we talked about earlier, and even by having a super high fat approach, you can still look great. But if we're going for that movie star look, we do need to drop the fats ever so slightly. Now, this video so far has contained lots of information that is contrary to other information in this video, and I do apologize if you're watching this video right now and you're pretty confused. Let me give you a few actionable steps. I think a 1-to-1 ratio, like I talked about earlier, is a good place to start. If you want to get lean, maybe drop the fats ever so slightly. And if you're trying to heal some condition, maybe consume more fats than this 1-to-1 ratio. If you're having stomach issues, you've got the runs, drop the fat. If you're constipated and don't feel amazing, up the fat. How much fat you need depends person to person. Make sure you hit the protein amount that we talked about earlier, which is 1 gram per pound of body weight, and then have as much fat as what feels right to you.
In today's video, we're going to be breaking down all the differences between the carnivore diet and the lion diet, so that by the end of this video, you know exactly which diet you should be doing. First, we're going to have a look at exactly what foods are included on each diet, and then we're going to break down the different effects that each diet will have on you. So, what are the differences? Well, we all know what the carnivore diet is. If it comes from an animal, you can eat it, with the exception of honey because it's technically bee vomit and most people don't consider it carnivore. But excluding honey, literally every other animal product, dairy, muscle meat, fat, organs, you name it, if it comes from an animal, it's considered carnivore. Now on the lion diet, things are taken one step further. The lion diet is literally just ruminant animals, salt, and water. So literally, if it's not any of those things, you can't have it. No dairy, no white meat, no nothing. Literally just ruminant meat, salt, and water. That's all you can include. So what is a ruminant animal? By definition, a ruminant animal is an animal that has 4 stomachs. Now this is very different from, say, a monogastric animal like a chicken, as they only have 1 stomach. The 2 most notable examples of ruminant animals are things like cows and sheep, which are consumed obviously as beef and lamb. When an animal is a ruminant animal and has a multi-chambered stomach, it is much better at breaking down the food that it eats. So regardless as to what it's fed, by the time they break down what they eat and it gets to their flesh remains pure. However, for animals such as pigs and chicken, which as I just mentioned, are monogastric animals, they only have 1 stomach. And so what ends up happening is that these animals are often fed improper diets, things like corn and soy and a bunch of other garbage that they put in the pellets that they feed these animals. And because they don't have these complex multi-chambered stomachs, they're not able to break this down. So instead of their skin and fat in particular, but just their flesh in general, being full of omega-3 fatty acids, what ends up happening is that it instead becomes higher in omega-6 fatty acids, such as linoleic acid, which is problematic for humans and is inflammatory. Now, to a lot of people, you can eat chicken, you can eat pork, and you're going to feel just fine. However, there are some people who definitely do a lot better on the lion diet. Another pro with ruminant animals is that they're often actually fed their natural diet of grass. Now, it's very important that a species eats its species-appropriate diet, as when a species eats a plant for an extended period of time, it begins to develop adaptations to break down the defense chemicals in that plant that it's consuming. An example of this is goats. Goats eat grass, and in grass there is a defense chemical called tannins. Now over time, goats have developed an enzyme called tannins, which breaks down tannins before they begin to digest and absorb it, so tannins don't affect them. So because it's cheap and easy for farmers just to put cows in a paddock and let them eat their species-appropriate diet in grass, it's going to further help keep their flesh pure. However, with chickens, it's much easier just to put them in a barn and feed them some rubbish grains, which is what we see happen all the time, and it's the reason that most eggs in your supermarket don't have the word pasture-raised written on them. So, what is this linoleic acid going to do to you? Well, like I said, it's inflammatory, which means it's going to damage our cells. Now, in particular, it's going to mess with the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of our cell. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to mess with our metabolism. As I said, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, so it literally creates all of our energy. When the mitochondria is damaged and it can't produce energy as effectively, guess what happens to our energy levels? And when our energy levels decrease, the amount of movement we do, the amount of moving our hands when we're talking, that sort of stuff, even just tapping your leg, that all decreases. And this is what is referred to as NEAT. Now, NEAT makes a massive difference to the number of calories we burn per day. What's very interesting to note is that in the last 20 years or so, the number of calories that humans have been consuming hasn't actually increased that much. However, the amount of inflammatory foods we've been eating has, which means our NEAT has dropped, we've been burning less calories, and as a consequence, humanity has been gaining weight. So the first difference between the carnivore diet and the lion diet is that because you're consuming less of this omega-6 linoleic acid, your metabolism is going to be slightly faster if you're not eating the stuff. Now, don't get me wrong, eating a chicken that is fed an improper diet is still 100 times better for you than the ultra-processed garbage that most people eat. So please don't think I'm saying never eat chicken again. That's not at all what I'm saying. If you want to eat chicken, eat chicken. I'm just saying, for some people, if you're on carnivore and you're still having problems, this could be why. Now, the next thing that this linoleic acid could be contributing to is depression and anxiety. This from a surface view kinda sounds ridiculous. However, many of the hormones that make us happy, when we're in an inflamed state, it makes it a lot harder for us to make them. Now, an example of this is serotonin, 90% of which is made in our guts. So when we're eating something that's inflammatory to us, it's going to be a lot harder to produce this. And remember earlier how I talked about eating this stuff is going to damage your mitochondria? Well, have a listen to what this doctor from Harvard, Chris Palmer, who specializes on the human brain, has to say.
It turns out that mitochondria play a direct role in neurotransmitter production and regulation. Like neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. It turns out it plays an important role in inflammation, turning it on and off. They play a role in the regulation of gene expression in the nucleus. They play a role, here's the thing, they play a role in the human stress response.
So if you've been on carnivore for an extended period of time and you're still having issues with depression and anxiety, you might want to consider trying the lion diet for a bit. It could be coffee too, so if you're still including that, be careful, it could be that. So as long as we're eating an animal that's pasture raised, why isn't that fine to include in the lion diet? Now this is where it gets interesting. Pasture raised chickens are left in big open fields. However, chickens naturally in the wild don't live in big open fields. If they did, they'd just get attacked by different species all day. Foxes, you name it, they'd come after them. Chickens are a pretty weak and defenseless bird, which is another reason why you shouldn't eat them. Why would you want to eat a little weak defenseless bird when you can eat a massive tank of an animal like a cow? Pure muscle, essentially. Not a point I had written out for this video, but it is something to think about. So chickens would actually like to live in a more condensed area where there's trees around and not really grassy paddocks as such. And so remember when I talked about earlier how it's important that a species eats its species appropriate diet. Even when chickens are out in the pasture, they're still not really eating their species appropriate diet. And even if they were, because they only have a single stomach, they can't break down the defense chemicals as such, and it leaves their meat less pure as well. So you're definitely better off just sticking to a lion diet if you still have issues on the carnivore diet. Basically, every illness and disease, the root cause of it is inflammation. Now, like I said earlier, having a little bit more linoleic acid in your diet because you're including chicken or something like that is probably not going to be the end of the world. If you want to be completely optimal, then sure, probably a lion diet is best. But again, it's still a lot better than the ultra-processed garbage. If you feel like eating some chicken and you're thriving, eat some chicken. Even I, from time to time, will eat meats other than beef. Very rarely, because I actually prefer the taste of beef a lot more than other animals. However, I do on occasion still include it. Now, that rather conveniently brings me to my next point, the natural progression that most people seem to have. When you eat beef, your body recognizes not only are there no toxins in it, but that it also contains every single nutrient we need in the perfect quantities. And so when you eat this, you feel amazing, you have high energy, and so your body sends you more and more of a positive feedback mechanism, in the sense that it starts tasting better and better. So most people find on carnivore, things like beef start tasting better and better and better, and things like chicken start tasting worse. So what you'll often find is that most people naturally progress towards a lion diet anyway. So if you're starting carnivore, don't stress about this too much. Eat a variety of meats, and you'll probably find that you start to naturally progress to a beef-only diet at some point anyway. So, what should you do? Should you do the lion diet, or should you do the carnivore diet? My advice is pretty simple. If you're on carnivore and you're feeling amazing, keep doing what you're doing. Eat whatever you like. However, if you have symptoms of any kind, I do recommend you do a strict lion diet, as it is the best elimination diet and the best diet for healing. I would do this for minimum 30 days. If you have something more serious, probably 90 days.
In today's video, I'm going to explain the issue with modern fruit and why I think that humans should avoid it. A lot of people believe that because fruit is natural and fruit is the least offended part of a plant, that it's good for us and it's safe to consume. However, by the end of this video, after hearing about how fruit has been modified by humans for the last 10,000 years, I think a lot of you will change your minds. In this video, I'm going to show you how fruit has changed over the years. First, by giving you examples of how different fruits are in comparison to how they used to be. Then I'm going to talk about the methods that we've used in the last 10,000 years to manipulate crops to make them sweeter and more pest resistant, as well as how in more recent years scientists have taken this process one step further and started copying and pasting genes into other fruits. And then finally, I'll break down how this genetically modified fruit affects us, including how it makes us fat and how this foreign DNA causes inflammation in our bodies. The first example we're going to look at is bananas. As you can see on screen, old bananas used to have seeds in them, and they were drastically less sweeter than they are nowadays. Then we have peaches, who used to be a small fruit with a large stone, and now they're a large fruit with a much smaller stone. Their skin also used to be very waxy, now it's a lot softer. If you had a look at these two fruits, which in theory is the same fruit, side by side, you would not believe that they're the same thing. And then finally we're going to look at corn, which is obviously not a fruit, but it's a great example of how far we've taken this genetically modifying process. As you can see, the corn we have nowadays is drastically bigger. It probably has 100 times more energy now than the unmodified version it once was. So how did all of this begin? Well, for the most part, humans are quite intelligent. The fact that you're currently seeing a video from someone on the other side of the world talking to you right now is a great example of how far technology has progressed. So what happened is about 12,000 years ago, when we came out of the Ice Age and began the agricultural revolution and started farming, is that farmers realized that certain plants had very desirable traits. The sweeter a fruit was, the better it tasted. The faster it grew, the more of it they could produce. The more pest resistant it was, the more food they'd also get. So what they would do is they'd start growing plants together in the hope that they'll pick up these desirable traits from one another. And then as soon as one plant had all the desirable traits that they wanted, they'd just mass grow that one plant. Whilst I was researching for this video, I found a great video that illustrates this process.
Let's say you wanted to make a consistently blue tomato that could be sold to grocery stores and chefs nationwide. And let's assume blue tomatoes already occur in some wild tomatoes in nature, but not consistently enough to sell to the masses. Breeders would then plant seeds from those wild tomatoes, the mostly blue ones, and seeds from a successful domesticated tomato. When those tomato seeds begin to flower, a plant breeder would remove the pollen from one flower and place it in the flower of the other variety. This resulting batch of tomatoes born is called F1 in the seed breeding world.
Imagine it's the year 8000 BC and you're responsible for feeding your small village. In one of your crops, you have this one apple that's super sweet, it grows very quickly, but it has terrible pest resistance. So what ends up happening is that the insects get to your crop and they destroy it before you can eat it. And then in another part of your crops, you have this different type of apple. Now it doesn't taste very good, but it's very pest resistant and the insects do not touch it. Do you reckon that in order to make sure all the people you love and care about have enough food, that you wouldn't get a bit creative and see what you could come up with? Now when you play this exact situation out across many different villages for tens of thousands of years, a lot of people started to catch on and we came up with some very clever methods. This worked very effectively over a long enough time horizon. Over the course of a decade, you could drastically change the way a plant tasted, the way it looked, and how resistant to pests it was. However, this process was very time consuming, and you sort of had to get lucky in a sense that the plant you were growing had all the desired traits that you wanted in it. I'm sure there are a few farmers that got the rough end of the stick, and the apples that they grew not only tasted bad, but they grew slow and they weren't very pest resistant. In 1973, a couple of scientists discovered a process called genetic engineering, where they were able to insert DNA from one bacteria to another. And 20 years later, humans started doing this to plants. So now not only have we had all this crossbreeding going on for 10,000 years, but now we literally have plants with their genes being copied and pasted into another plant. Now most fruits nowadays are GMO free, which basically means it hasn't had this lab DNA altering process done to them. However, if a plant has been manipulated by being crossbred for tens of thousands of years, just because it hasn't been done in a lab, it doesn't mean it's in its natural state. It's kind of like someone stating that none of the rooms in their house are green, but when someone points out to them their bright green bedroom, they try to argue, don't be silly, that's clearly lime coloured. So what is the issue with all of these drastic changes occurring? Well, the first issue lies in the fact that it's more pest resistant. When something is more pest resistant, it also means it's more defended. So all these defense chemicals that we typically see in fruits like tannins, lectins, polyphenols, you name it, are going to be present in higher quantities. And it's been clearly documented that these compounds are not good for humans. When a species consumes a specific plant for hundreds of thousands of years, they develop adaptations to help break down some of the defense chemicals in these plants. A great example of this is goats, who have eaten grass for an extended period of time and they've developed an enzyme in their saliva called tannins, which breaks down a defense chemical known as tannins. Humans have only consumed a very small amount of this hyper sweet, hyper defended plant, and therefore it's going to be inflammatory to us, as we don't have any of the mechanisms to break the stuff down. Now, inflammation is the root cause of every disease, and I'm not saying fruit is the worst cause of inflammation. All I'm doing is pointing out that at least to some degree this fruit is going to be inflammatory. The extra sugar from this fruit in the form of both glucose and fructose is also going to fatten people up. Maybe if you're an individual who's always had a very small appetite and therefore always been very lean, and you live in some tropical island where you work out all the time, maybe then you can eat fruit and stay lean. But I think for most people, if you eat fruit, it will fatten you up. The super unnatural level of sugar that does not naturally occur in nature is going to cause massive blood sugar spikes. And the problem with this is when your blood sugar spikes up nice and high, it comes crashing back down. But it doesn't stop at its baseline, it goes below that level. In this state, you are known as something called hyperglycemic, which basically means that your blood sugar levels are below its baseline, and your body literally thinks it's dying. It thinks it's run out of fat, and what happens is you become obscenely hungry. This is why you're ridiculously hungry 3 hours after eating your favourite overnight apple oats, which your favourite fitness influencer has told you is a great breakfast for weight loss. As well as the fact that as soon as your blood sugar levels spike, another hormone leptin, which is responsible for telling your body to stop eating, is blocked. Eating fruit will make you considerably hungrier, which will make you eat more and therefore gain weight. I don't think too many people would argue with me on this point.
Hey guys, it's me again. I wanted to let you all know that I've written an ebook which is a complete beginner's guide on the carnivore diet. It's only 17 pages long and it covers everything you need to know. So whether you want to refresh your knowledge or you're a beginner who's looking to get onto the carnivore diet and doesn't know where to start, this one's for you. All you have to do is head down to the description of this video, click the top link, and I'll send it to you for free. And on top of that, I'll send you a couple emails each week with some bonus tips I have regarding the carnivore diet. And the best part is that there's no catch. It's literally all for free. So go down to the description to claim your free copy now. Anyway, back to the video. For others, you may also experience some digestive issues. Fructose is a FODMAP, which basically means it's one of the most common foods that cause digestive issues in people. So when a fruit is sweeter and it contains more of this fructose, the chances are it's going to wreak havoc on some people's stomachs. So in summary, fruit has been modified for an extended period of time. The fruit we have nowadays is way sweeter than it should be. It's way more defended than it typically would. We are simply not equipped to deal with this new variation of fruit that is not present in nature alone. Now I haven't even touched on the man-made chemical pesticides that they cover the stuff in, but even just the fruit alone grown without pesticides will likely be at least somewhat inflammatory, lead to weight gain, and in some people it may cause digestive issues. Now if you're deciding on your dessert tonight and you're choosing between an apple or a double fudge sundae with a side of soda, I think we can all agree that the apple is at least 10 times better for you than that. But in my opinion, I think the optimal human diet is a carnivorous diet, the way humans have eaten for the majority of our existence. I personally used to eat 10 servings of vegetables per day and lots of fruit, and ever since I've removed all of that stuff, I've felt so much better it's almost incomparable. It's a night and day difference. In today's video, I'm going to be breaking down everything you need to know about electrolytes and the carnivore diet. And if you stick around to the end, I'll give you my step-by-step guide so that you never get a cramp again. So what are electrolytes? By definition, electrolytes are minerals that have an electric charge. Now there are quite a few different electrolytes. Thankfully, however, we can get all of these in meat. For most people, you'll never even run into electrolyte problems on carnivore. However, there are 4 main electrolytes that some people have issues with. All the others seem to regulate themselves, and I've never heard of anyone having issues with any of them. So why do we even need electrolytes? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but I want to keep this video short and to the point. So in summary, electrolytes are essential to regulate the amount of water our body holds onto and to make us not feel terrible. The main issue people experience is when they're not getting enough electrolytes and they get terrible muscle cramps. When I first started the carnivore diet, I experienced this. I remember one night I was lying peacefully in bed having a nice sleep, and I woke up to what felt like a shark biting my leg. Now I no longer get these because of what I'm about to explain in this video. However, if you're not careful, it can be seriously unpleasant. Now, the key reason people run into electrolyte issues on the carnivore diet is because the carnivore diet is a low carbohydrate diet. When you go on a low carbohydrate diet, your body excretes more electrolytes, meaning that even if you consume the same amount you were consuming on a regular diet, you still may run into issues. Now, over time, your body starts to adapt and it becomes much better at retaining your electrolytes. However, at the start, you do need to be careful. The most essential thing for avoiding electrolyte problems is to consume enough salt. Salt is a combination of sodium and chloride, 2 of the essential electrolytes we talked about earlier. Now, the vast majority of electrolyte problems on the carnivore diet can simply be resolved by adding more salt to your meals. What a lot of people seem to forget is that the processed foods they were consuming before they went on the carnivore diet contain massive amounts of sodium. So they go on carnivore and they add the same amount of salt to their steaks that they usually would. So your body's used to getting all the salt from the processed foods, and now it's only getting that small amount you put on your steak. So not only are you having a lot less salt, but because you're in this low carbohydrate state, your body's not as effective at retaining it as well. So how much salt should you be having? Well, whatever tastes good to you. Our bodies are incredibly sophisticated machines, and if our body needs a lot of something, it will make sure that it tastes good. What most people, including myself, find is that when you go on the carnivore diet, you want a lot of salt on your steaks. Seriously, at the start I was putting an absurd amount on. My friends were concerned for my health. However, over time, as your body gets better and better at retaining the salt and gets better adapted to this low carbohydrate state, you start to need a lot less. And so what ends up happening is that over time, less and less salt tastes good to you. Like if I had a steak right now with the amount of salt that I had in my first week of carnivore, it would taste terrible. And if I had a steak in my first week of carnivore with the amount of salt I put on now, it would taste like there's no salt on it. So listen to your taste buds. Remember, there are a number of reasons as to why you need more salt now, and over time you'll notice that you're having less and less. Another thing you need to be careful of is what salt you buy. Often you'll go to the supermarket and you'll see salt packaged as something like table salt or something along the lines of that, and you would assume that table salt would mean salt. However, they often have things like anti-caking agents in there, so make sure that the salt you choose is 100% salt and doesn't have some other garbage in there. Now, a lot of people are scared to have salt because they think it's bad for you. However, all the studies that show salt is bad for you have something known as healthy user bias. So essentially what happens is they compare 2 groups of people that eat a lot of salt and people that don't have a lot of salt. However, guess what? The people who do eat a lot of salt, guess where they're getting that salt from?
Do you reckon they're putting a lot more salt on their vegetables? Or do you reckon they're getting their salt from things like fast food, all that hyper-processed garbage in the store, which, as we talked about earlier, has a lot of salt? So then they compare these two groups, the ultra-processed high-sodium group and the much less processed food, lower sodium group. And have a guess what happens? Wow, who would have thought that people on less salt are healthier? So you tell me, is it the salt that's the problem, or is it the fact that they're eating less of that ultra-processed chemical garbage? For the vast majority of people, all you need to do is salt your meat to taste and you'll be completely fine regarding electrolytes. Now, the other two electrolytes that you might need to think about are magnesium and potassium. Now, at the start, there might be a few people that need a little bit more of this. However, over time, your body will regulate and it'll get used to the amount you're getting from your meat alone. So unless you're getting absolutely terrible cramps, I wouldn't even bother thinking about these two. Let your body do its thing. However, there are a few people that may need to think about magnesium and potassium supplementation. Now, these people are athletes, people who sweat a lot. Maybe you work a very physical job, or you live in a country that's very hot, so you're always sweating. Or maybe you're just a genetic outlier who doesn't hang on to electrolytes very well. Now, in all my time coaching people on the carnivore diet, I've never had someone have a problem with these two electrolytes. However, I have heard people talk online about this, so there may be some cases where you do need to supplement with a little bit of magnesium and potassium. However, like I said, I wouldn't add the supplementation in straight away, as your body will more than likely resolve itself. However, if after 30 days you're still running into issues and you've put plenty of salt on your meat, then I would definitely recommend supplementing a few electrolytes. One thing you do need to be careful of when you supplement these, though, is stomach issues. It is essential that the fluid levels in your body are at the right amount. So if you consume too many electrolytes, your body has to get rid of them so you don't retain too much fluid. And because your body wants to get rid of all these excess electrolytes, it can cause serious stomach issues in the form of diarrhea. I had a client who did this. A month or two into carnivore, he started telling me that he was getting diarrhea. We went through the typical reasons why this might be. Maybe a massive increase in the amount of coffee someone's drinking. Maybe a massive increase in the amount of fat someone's eating. And I couldn't quite work out why, until he told me that he was supplementing with magnesium potassium because he was sweating a lot. And by the sounds of it, his stomach really went through it. So if you are going to supplement some magnesium and potassium, be careful with how much you have. So how do you never ever get a cramp on carnivore again? Very simple. Like I said, add enough salt till it tastes good. And then give your body 30 days to get used to the low carbohydrate state and the changes it's going through. Now in these 30 days, if you're having lots of salt and you're still getting cramps, which is very unlikely for most people, then you might want to add a little bit of magnesium and potassium, but slowly start tapering it down as time goes on. However, if these cramps are only minor, I would just let your body do its thing naturally without any supplementation at all. Now, if after 30 days, you may just be one of those outliers I talked about earlier, and so start supplementing a little bit of magnesium and a little bit of potassium, and like I said, just slowly start to taper it down till you get to a point where you don't need it. So yeah, that's all you need to know about electrolytes. If you have any other questions, leave them down below so I can get back to you. Building muscle on the carnivore diet is ridiculously easy. It's almost too easy, in fact. If you just look at a dumbbell for too long, you might accidentally put on some muscle. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. The first being that your testosterone is just going to increase monumentally. When you stop eating these plants and you don't have these toxins in your body is able to run much more efficiently. As a result, your testosterone is going to skyrocket. Testosterone itself is literally a steroid, and it's not uncommon for people to go on this diet and their testosterone to literally double. Whenever you work out, you break down your muscle fibers, and when you eat enough protein, it repairs them and they grow back slightly bigger and stronger than they were last time. That's literally all there is to muscle building. So when you have a diet of only meat, the highest protein food that there is, it's very easy to hit your protein intake and you gain muscle super easily as a result. Now, if all you do is follow these 4 simple steps, you're going to gain so much muscle that you're going to struggle to believe it. Now, the first thing you need to do is lift weights. This is pretty obvious. I would highly recommend at least 3 days a week of heavy resistance training. Now, you want to do 10 sets per muscle group. This is the optimal amount to recover properly. However, you want to do every single one of these sets to failure. So what are the best exercises to do? Well, on screen I'll attach right now a copy of my exact program, which has the best exercise for every single body part. So if you do these 10 sets per week with the best exercises possible, and you have good form, you essentially have the perfect workout program. One thing you need to remember is that 50% of the gains you make are in controlling the weight down. You see a lot of people, they throw the weight up and they don't control it down. So whatever you do, make sure you don't do this. It's much better if you control the weight on the way down. The second thing you need to do is eat enough meat. Wow, who would have thought? Revolutionary advice, I know. The thing with carnivore though is a lot of people get carried away with the high fat and they end up not eating enough protein. You need 1.25 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So if you weigh 180 pounds, you want 225 grams of protein. Remember, it's the protein that builds the muscle. Yes, fat is great for your hormones and it's going to help you build that testosterone, which will help your muscles grow, but you do need the protein as well. The third thing you need is to eat straight after you work out. A lot of people in carnivore do OMAD and they'll work out in the morning and they won't eat till night. As soon as you work out, you've torn down these muscle fibers and your body wants the protein to recover. So if you are someone who likes to do OMAD, I would highly recommend you schedule your workout right before you eat. Now, I'm sure you can still make gains from working out in the morning and not eating till night, but it's going to be significantly better if you eat straight away and give your body the food it needs to recover. And then finally, don't be a dumbass. It's pretty simple, really. What do I mean by this? Do the basics right. Get enough sleep. If you sleep 6 hours and you sleep 8 hours, your testosterone doubles from having that 2 hours of extra sleep. There have been studies that have shown this. Another thing, being dehydrated is terrible for your gains. When you're dehydrated, that recovery that is so important, the fundamental part where your muscle grows back bigger and stronger than last time, is seriously impaired. So if you're thirsty, make sure you have some water. Also, don't have cold showers after you train. So many people have this notion that cold showers are good for muscle gain. As I mentioned, when you work out, you cause micro tears in your muscle fibers. Now this is inflammation. So when you have this cold shower, which reduces inflammation, you're reducing the amount of muscle gains that you can have. And last but certainly not least is don't fall for these gimmicky products. I see these infomercials of these like ab packs that you put on your abs and it vibrates for 20 minutes and it burns all these calories and makes you ripped. It's complete and utter rubbish. Every single person who's ever built a good physique is in the gym, lifting weights and eating protein. And that's literally all you need to gain muscle on the carnivore diet. When you have the increased testosterone levels and the right amount of protein, all you need to do is a few workouts a week and you're going to gain muscle. Now, coffee is by far the most common plant that people still include on a carnivore diet. But is the coffee you're drinking ruining your results? In today's video, we're going to be exploring just this. First, I'm going to break down which defense chemicals are present in coffee and how these defense chemicals will affect us. Then, we're going to look at the 4 groups of people who should almost certainly avoid coffee on the carnivore diet and look at some other issues we see in coffee, such as pesticides. And finally, I'm going to give my recommendation as to whether the average person on carnivore should continue to consume coffee, as well as some bonus tips on how to make your coffee as healthy as possible. The thing that always makes me laugh about coffee is that there are so many people in the carnivore community who have somehow convinced themselves that there is one plant that's good for us. I see many people in the carnivore community say things like, well, actually, coffee drinkers have been shown to have a 14% less chance of having a stroke, and therefore coffee is neuroprotective. However, the fact about coffee is that it is a bean, and a bean is a seed, and a seed is the most defended part of the plant as it is the plant's offspring. Now, there is one thing with coffee that does make it less bad, as say, in comparison to things like vegetables, and that is the fact that we only consume a very small amount of it. A serving of vegetables is at least 100 grams, whereas a serving of coffee is roughly 3 to 4 grams. Now, this isn't to say that it's not going to affect us, however, it will have a less of an effect than these other plants which we consume in much larger doses. Now, coffee, because it's a plant, it is going to contain defense chemicals. Phytic acid, tannins, and lectins are a good example of these. All of these are anti-nutrient properties. They bind to minerals, which inhibits their absorption. They're also going to cause inflammation to our guts and just, well, our bodies in general, as well as other defense compounds which affect our hormones. Whenever we drink coffee, our stress hormones elevate, which indicates to us that these are present. And then, well, we have caffeine. Now, caffeine is the main reason that most people consume coffee, and it's actually a defense chemical in itself. Caffeine is created by the plant in order to fry the brains of small insects that try and eat it. Now, these defense compounds are no different to any plant defense compounds in the sense that they're going to cause inflammation. And inflammation is the root cause of every disease. I don't think having a small amount of one bean every morning is going to do too much harm to you, but for some people, they will notice the effects. Now, let's discuss the 4 types of people who should not be including caffeine on their carnivore diet. The first of which are people with anxiety or mood disorders. First and foremost, like I talked about, they're inflammatory, which means they're going to damage our cells, and our entire bodies are made from cells. So when these are damaged and they're not functioning properly, it just leads to a number of issues. One thing this inflammation may do is damage our guts. Now, the gut health of humans plays a key role in how we feel. So if you are someone who's just hypersensitive to the defense compounds in coffee and it damages your gut, and consequently you can't produce as many of the happy hormones that you require to feel good, for those people, coffee will be a problem. Some people, like I said, who are hypersensitive to plants need to remove every single one, and coffee is no exception to that. An example of this is Michaela Peterson, the daughter of Jordan Peterson. And they affected her so badly that by the age of 20, she had to have 2 joints replaced. When asked if she'd rather her depression go away or her arthritis, which was going to kill her, to go away, she said that she'd rather her anxiety go away. So she went on carnivore, removed all the plants from her diet, and yeah, her depression literally just vanished. Another factor that can contribute to coffee making you feel anxious is the stress response from coffee. Like I talked about earlier, many of our stress hormones increase when we drink coffee. And many people report that when they drink coffee, their anxiety levels increase. So if you are someone who is an anxious person or you have a mood disorder where you just don't feel happy, you do want to remove all plants. The second type of person who should remove coffee on the carnivore diet are people that have sleep issues or are always tired. You see, coffee, or caffeine more specifically, has something known as the quarter life. Now, the quarter life of caffeine is 12 hours, which essentially means when you have some caffeine, 12 hours later, a quarter of it is still in your system. Now, for some people, this number varies. Some people are what they call faster or slower metabolizers of caffeine. So for some people, this might be a bit shorter, and for others, it may be a bit longer. But as a general rule, it's 12 hours. And so essentially what this means is that if you've had coffee anytime within the last 12 hours before you go to bed, it's going to affect the quality of your sleep. Now, even if you are someone who can drink 5 cups of coffee before you go to bed, it's going to affect the quality of your sleep. For humans to have optimal sleep, they need to go into something known as REM sleep, which stands for rapid eye movement. It's basically when you're sleeping and your eyes are moving up and down, still shut, rapidly. However, when we have caffeine in our system, it severely impairs our ability to get into this deep sleep. So even if you sleep for the exact same amount of time, because your sleep quality is just not the same, you're going to end up feeling more tired even despite having the same amount of sleep. Oh yeah, also, I'm now on Instagram, so follow me on there. I'm posting 3 short form videos per day that aren't on here. And for everyone who goes on my one picture I have and comments that have come from YouTube, I'll follow you back. So yeah, if you want to see more of me, head over to my Instagram. I'm sure you can see the name on screen right now, assuming I remembered to put it on the slides, which I will have. Anyway, back to regular programming. The third type of person who should look to avoid coffee on the carnivore diet are people who are having persisting digestive issues. Obviously, for many people, when you start the carnivore diet, your first couple of weeks in particular, you will have digestive issues because you're adapting. I've talked about this in other videos, which I'll link to at the end. However, for some people, coffee acts as a laxative. And the fourth and final group of people that should definitely not be consuming coffee on the carnivore diet is people with an autoimmune condition. Now, these people in particular should definitely avoid it. The root cause of autoimmune conditions, well, technically it is unknown, but based on the fact that nearly everyone goes on the carnivore diet, well, actually, I should say, by the sounds of it, everyone that goes on the carnivore diet at least sees their autoimmune conditions improve. It's highly likely that, once again, caused by inflammation. So yeah, like I've talked about throughout this video, the defense compounds in coffee are just going to be problematic for some people. So if you have an autoimmune condition, you definitely don't want to be including coffee. Coffee is sprayed in pesticides. Now, pesticides are quite literally just man-made chemicals made in a lab, all these synthetic process, like it's poison. Like there's no other way to put it. That's what it is. And every coffee bean is sprayed in it. Now you can get organic coffee. However, organic isn't much better. Organic means natural pesticides. Now, think about it. What does natural even mean? Everything at some point or another is natural. So yeah, it's just a complete grey area between organic pesticides and regular pesticides. And the next issue is the roasting process itself. As we know, anything seared or charred becomes carcinogenic. Doesn't matter whether it's carrots, steak, coffee. If we sear it too much, it is carcinogenic, and we can taste this. This is why we don't like burnt food. And obviously with the coffee process, there is some roasting. So if you're someone who likes a really dark charred bean, like a really, really strong, intense one, you may want to think about that. I've talked about throughout the video, but your stress hormones are going to also increase. And another issue with coffee is that many people include some sort of dairy, like milk, with it. And so what this does is you're just going to have extra insulin spikes, which having too many of these is not ideal for us. So if you are someone who's having a few coffees a day and they're all containing dairy, you're just spiking your blood sugar over and over, which is certainly not ideal. And then finally, coffee is a diuretic. So at least to some degree, it will dehydrate you. And in doing so, it depletes some of your electrolytes, which, yeah, I mean, again, not ideal. In summary, no, coffee is not good for us. We all know this. However, for some people, the upsides of coffee may actually outweigh the downsides. In fact, for me personally, I still drink coffee. Like I said, I know it's not good for me, but the fact that I can have a late night, maybe I'm out or I've got lots of study to do, and then I can wake up in the morning after not having much sleep and then take this one seemingly magical bean that just completely gets rid of all tiredness. To me, being able to do that outweighs how bad coffee is, as well as the fact that I just enjoy drinking coffee. I do know that, at least to some degree, it will be doing harm to me, but yeah, like I said, to me, the pros outweigh the cons. However, if someone was to say to me, Max, I'm doing carnivore, should I continue to include coffee? My answer would be no. If you don't absolutely love coffee and you don't have to worry about performing on small amount of hours of sleep like I have to do some days, then you probably don't need coffee and it probably is just a net negative. So, the best type of coffee you can have is the one that doesn't exist. Don't do what I do. It's like I said, it's better to not have it. However, if you are going to consume coffee, the best you can do is to have it black. And the reason for that is because you're not going to have all these blood sugar spikes like I talked about. But black coffee can be quite bitter and a lot of people don't like the taste. That bitterness is literally our bodies sensing the defense chemicals, so that's how we know it's toxic. But if you're someone who doesn't like it bitter, the next best option you can have is probably to have it a bulletproof coffee with butter, and then after that, cream, and then finally the worst option you can, oh, actually, second to worst option I guess you could have would be with milk. Having butter or cream is slightly better than having milk because you're just not getting that carbohydrates and the lactose that comes from milk. Now, even though milk does contain a lot less energy, because it contains these carbohydrates, it's just going to block some of your hunger signaling and cause you to eat more food. So even though directly it has less energy in it than, say, butter or cream, what's going to happen is because your hunger signaling is not quite working properly, you're going to end up consuming more total energy having the milk than you would, say, the butter or the cream. You need to have a very small amount of these things because they're just super high in energy and it will stall your weight loss if you're having a considerable amount of either cream or butter. You also want to think about the type of coffee you're getting from a cafe. If you order a regular flat white or something like that, what they do is they often put like this much water in and the rest of it's milk. They're basically coffee milkshakes. So you're going to be consuming a lot of dairy. It's not like the one at home where you make it with mainly water and add a little bit of milk to the top. These things are basically entirely milk. So if you're consuming a significant amount of cafe coffee, you might want to think about that too. A trick you can use to get around this is to order an Americano. Now, an Americano is the exact same thing basically as a long black, but it just sounds a little bit less sus when you order it. And then you order a side of milk, a side of hot milk to be precise, and then you know how much milk is in your coffee and you're not drinking like an absurd amount of milk. And then the absolute worst coffee you can have is those rubbish powder coffees. Now, often you'll see like these quick sachets that are like cappuccinos or whatever they are. But when you look at the ingredients, it's full of seed oils, stabilizers, all these chemicals. So if you're going to have a coffee, have a coffee. Even if it's just find an instant powder that is 100% coffee if you really want an instant coffee. But yeah, do not, just have a look at the powders that you're buying. When you first start the carnivore diet, it can be incredibly confusing. You're told, eat all the meat you like, eat all the dairy you like, eat according to appetite. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Some people have adverse reactions to certain meats. Some meats are better for losing weight. Some meats are better at reducing inflammation. And the same goes with dairy. In fact, some types of dairy can re-trigger reward pathways and bring back sugar cravings. Don't get me wrong, all carnivore items are better than consuming plants. However, although many people don't like to admit it, carnivore is not as simple as eat all the meat and all the dairy you like and achieve all your goals. So in today's video, we're going to be ranking every single carnivore food, from S tier, meaning it's elite, all the way down to D tier. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which carnivore items are the best to consume and which ones you want to avoid if you want to have the best results. First up, we have lamb, which is just incredible in every aspect. You see, lamb is a ruminant animal, meaning it has a complex, multi-chambered stomach, which is able to effectively break down anything that it's fed, as well as the fact that with lamb, more often than not, they're at least predominantly fed grass. And because grass is the species appropriate diet for lamb, it means it's able to break it down properly, and it results in their flesh being very pure, I guess you could say. Lamb is incredibly nutrient dense, which means it's going to be incredibly satiating, which is great for weight loss. Lamb is straight in the S tier. Next up, we have chicken, in particular farmed chicken. You see, the problem with farmed chicken
is that they're typically fed grains. And unlike lamb, which as we talked about are ruminant animals, chickens are monogastric animals, meaning they only have a singular stomach, which is not very effective at breaking down what it's fed. And so because these chickens are fed grains, which obviously a chicken in the wild typically does not eat these ultra processed grains with like 30 different ingredients, what happens is the chickens aren't very effective, and so the rubbish ingredients that are in these grains end up in the flesh of the chicken. In fact, when we examine the fatty acid content of these chickens, what we find is that they're incredibly high in omega-6 fatty acids, such as linoleic acid. Now this right here is not good for our health. When the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is too skewed in favor of the omega-6s, it results in unfavorable health outcomes for us due to the inflammation it causes. The saying "you are what you eat" holds to be very true for every species, especially species like chickens who don't have very complex digestive systems. So because they're eating this garbage, their flesh also ends up containing this garbage, and consequently it really affects how we're going to rank chicken. So we're going to put farmed chicken in the B tier. Okay, so we know that farmed chicken's not the best, but what about pasture-raised chicken? What pasture-raised means is that the chickens are free to roam paddocks, and in these paddocks they dig up all sorts of things. They dig up worms, they eat some of the grasses, they eat some of the leaves, they eat a wide variety of foods. Now this is much better, and it ends up in the chicken being a lot healthier because it's much closer to its species appropriate diet. However, there's still actually one problem with this, and that is that wild chickens don't actually live in big open paddocks. If they did, they would get destroyed by predators like foxes. It would be an incredibly easy kill for these carnivorous animals if chickens were out in the open. So what wild chickens do is they actually go into more foresty areas. The trees in these forests allow them to blend in a lot better, which is crucial for their survival. So the pasture-raised chickens and the chickens that live in forests do actually eat slightly different diets, which is not ideal for us because when a species eats a certain plant for an extended period of time, they begin to develop adaptations to break down the defense compounds in that plant. A cool example of this is goats, who have developed an enzyme in their saliva called tannins, which breaks down one of the defense compounds in grass known as tannins. So what ends up happening is because these chickens aren't eating the same plants that they typically would in the wild, these plants still to at least some degree aren't ideal for them. And so because they can't break them down perfectly, the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in pasture-raised chickens is still higher than say like grass-fed beef or lamb. However, it's still considerably lower than it is with these grain-fed chickens. And chicken does also contain a lot of nutrients, so chicken is going in the A tier. Next up, we have salmon. First, we're going to look at wild salmon. Now, wild salmon's great. It gets to eat its species-appropriate diet of other fish. These salmon are incredibly healthy, they have beautiful orange skin, and they're also incredibly high in every single essential nutrient that we need. In fact, there are populations that have survived on almost exclusively salmon, such as the historic Inuit people. Now the Inuit people have actually modernized and have started eating some of our foods. And shockingly enough, they've also gone from a very healthy population to a population that has all the diseases that we have since making that switch. But the historic Inuit people actually lived on a diet exclusively of salmon. However, there is still one small problem with wild salmon, and that is, well, the mass amounts of pollution. The problem with all fish nowadays is that they do contain microplastics. As we all know, many corporations and I guess individuals to some degree dump large amounts of plastics in the ocean, which spreads far and wide, and the fish end up eating it. So most of the time when you're eating fish, regardless as to whether it's wild or farmed, you are eating at least a small amount of plastic. If I could time travel back 200 years ago and make this video then, salmon would be in the S tier because it didn't have this issue. However, because at least to some degree you're going to be eating a small amount of plastic, wild salmon is going to have to go on the A tier. And then, well, farmed salmon. This right here is a disgrace. Like with farmed chickens, farmed salmon are not fed their species appropriate diet. They're fed these rubbish pellets that are so nutritionally void that sometimes they have to add an orange cover, like literally get a brush, get some orange food dye or whatever it is, rub it on it, just so the salmon's orange. The salmon, again, it's incredibly high in the fats that we don't want, and the amount of this fat is just absurd. Because these fish are eating what they're not meant to eat, they get extremely fat. Now this would be fine if the fats were healthy fats. However, it simply is not. So as a result of all of these factors, farmed salmon is going to have to go in the B tier with farmed chicken. Next up, we're going to look at cheese. Now, cheese itself is not terrible. However, there are a number of issues that I see with dairy. The first being that it's incredibly addictive. Dairy contains a compound known as beta-casomorphin, which essentially acts is an opioid-like substance that makes you addicted. Now, I'm sure we've all experienced this. Once you start eating cheese, or just any dairy product for that matter, it's incredibly hard to stop eating it, as well as the fact that dairy isn't as nutrient dense as meat, which therefore means it's not going to fill you up as much. Think about it. Have you ever actually been full from eating cheese or any dairy for that matter alone? As we know, on Carnivore, we eat till we're full. It's possibly the only diet where you can never be hungry and achieve the body of your dreams. So let's think about this. If we've got two different foods, let's say we've got some fatty ruminant meat, such as lamb like we talked about earlier. Chances are if we eat the exact same amount of each, we're still going to be hungry from the cheese, but we'll be full from the lamb. So then we're going to eat more, and we're just going to eat more and more energy, which is going to slow the weight loss down. Now, raw cheese is definitely better than pasteurized cheese. The reason being that when something's pasteurized, it's heated to a high temperature to kill the bacteria in it, which allows it to last for longer. The problem being that in doing so, it denatures many of the proteins in the dairy, which then makes it inflammatory. I find personally that if I consume pasteurized dairy, my skin breaks out in acne. Cheese is not terrible. You don't have to avoid it completely, but it just is nowhere near as good as any cut of meat, to tell you the truth. So for that reason, it's going in the C tier. Next up, we have beef, probably the greatest food on the planet. For all the reasons that I talked about with lamb, it is just incredible. It's incredibly nutrient dense. The fatty acid profile in it is essentially perfect. And I mean, it just tastes incredible too. Beef is quite literally the perfect food. So beef is going straight in the S tier, right next to lamb. And for those of you who are wondering, there's very little difference in how good each of them is for you. So if you're contemplating, do I eat beef, do I eat lamb? They're both very similar. Next up, we have pork. And due to the fact that I don't want to repeat myself and make this a repetitive video, everything I said with chicken applies to pork. Pork and chicken are incredibly similar in nearly every aspect. They're both monogastric animals, they both have a very similar nutrient density, and they both have the exact same issues as to whether they're pasture-raised or grain-fed. So everything I've said about chicken, it applies to pork, and therefore they're going to be ranked essentially the same. One thing that's interesting with pork is that pork is actually meant to be a red meat if it's fed its proper species-appropriate diet. Growing up, every time I went to the supermarket, I would see pork completely white. So I just always assumed, well, pork's a white meat. The reason for this is the same with salmon. The grains they're fed are so nutritionally void that they do not contain sufficient amounts of nutrients for pork to develop their natural red color. Wild pork is in the A tier and grain-fed pork is in the B tier. After finishing filming, I just realized that I forgot bacon. What a travesty that would have been. Bacon is essentially pork, so it's going to have all the same issues like pork does that chicken has. But there's one other thing you really need to consider about bacon, and that is that often bacon isn't actually bacon. And what I mean by this is that when you look at the back of the packaging with bacon, it's often only like 85% bacon. It's like 15% preservatives, additives, fillers, just a whole bunch of other garbage. So be careful with the bacon you're selecting. If you can find proper bacon that's like 99% pork with 1% salt, that's great. It's the exact same as pork. But make sure you're getting bacon that's actually bacon and it doesn't contain all these rubbish ingredients. Anyways, apologies for nearly forgetting it. Back to where I was before. Next up, we have eggs. Eggs are great. You can often get them very cheap. They taste good. However, eggs again can run the exact same issues as chicken. If they're fed grains, these grains typically end up in them. Eggs are incredibly nutrient dense, in particular the yolk. If you're getting pasture-raised eggs, they are incredible. They actually would be close to an S tier, but you just cannot put anything in the same level as ruminant meat. So for that reason, they're going to be high A tier if they're pasture raised, and then B tier if they're from a grain-fed chicken. Next, we're going to look at wild game, and wild game typically is ruminant animals. Deer, elk, venison, you name it, anything like that, they are ruminant animals. Now, if you can find fatty wild game, they would be S tier. However, unfortunately, these wild meats are typically very lean. They do a lot of moving around so they burn off all their fat, and humans cannot survive eating only protein. What happens when all we do is eat protein is we develop something known as rabbit starvation. To survive, humans need either carbohydrates, which isn't ideal for us, or fats, and because this wild game only contains protein, we cannot survive eating it alone. And so whilst it's a great addition, because it's going to contain none of the bad stuff whilst also being incredibly nutrient dense, because we can't eat it alone, it's going to have to go in the A tier. Next up, we're going to look at milk. First up, raw milk. Now, raw milk is definitely better than pasteurized milk due to the issues with pasteurization that we talked about earlier. However, even with raw milk, it's high in carbohydrates in the form of glucose and lactose. Now, we all know this, it has an incredibly sweet taste to it. And the problem with this is that, one, it's going to re-trigger cravings. When our brains release dopamine, which is a pleasure hormone, as a result of the sweet taste, it re-triggers these dopamine reward pathways, and it can make us crave other sugary items. So if you are someone who's had a sugar addiction, this is definitely not ideal, which is most people, because as we can see looking across society, most people are addicted to sugar. So for a lot of people, drinking raw milk is going to do a lot more harm than good. Another problem with the carbohydrates this contains is that when we eat carbohydrates, it spikes our blood sugar significantly. And we have another hormone called insulin that also rises to bring our blood sugar back down. Now, the problem with this is that as soon as our insulin levels rise, it blocks another hormone called leptin. Now, the role of leptin is essentially to send a signal to our brain saying, we don't need to eat anymore, we've got all we need. So as you can imagine, when this leptin signaling is blocked before it can get to our brain, it's not ideal, it's going to cause us to overeat. And for some people, it will result in weight loss, either plateauing or gaining weight even. Now, I don't hear a lot of people talk about it, and I hate to be a dairy hater, but I'm also under the belief that dairy from another species may not be super ideal for humans. In fact, up until about 10,000 years ago, we couldn't even break the stuff down. When we look at human fossils from around that time, we had none of the LCT gene, otherwise known as the lactose gene, which meant that 10,000 years ago, everyone was lactose intolerant. And when we look at the hunter-gatherer tribes of wild humans who have not started farming and therefore they have not been drinking milk, they also have none of this gene. All dairy products contain a number of hormones designed for the growth of baby cows. They're high in estrogen as well as many other hormones. And the effects that these hormones have on us is pretty unknown, to be honest with you. There's not a lot of science on the topic. Now, drinking some milk every now and then is nowhere near as bad as eating ultra-processed garbage. It's not going to make you sick, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But if you're trying to absolutely optimize your health, I don't think dairy is super ideal for most people. So because of these reasons, raw milk is going into the C tier. And then when it comes to pasteurized milk, we have obviously all the issues with raw milk as well as the pasteurization. So that's going to go in the D tier. Now, this doesn't mean it's terrible for you. It just means it's nowhere near as good for you as some of the other items on this list. So what about cream? Well, again, cream typically is pasteurized, so it's going to have that issue. Now, the good thing about cream is that it contains no carbohydrates, so it's not going to block our hunger signaling to the same degree. However, there's a massive issue with cream in the sense that it's incredibly easy to overconsume. You see, cream is essentially just fat, and unlike, say, fat that would have with our ground beef or with our steak, it's not incredibly satiating. So because it's incredibly high in fat, it also means it's incredibly high in energy. Now, obviously, body fat on our body is stored energy. So the more energy we consume from foods, the less energy our body's going to take from its own fat, and therefore it's going to slow our weight loss down. Now, again, this isn't to say that cream is terrible. In fact, if you were to only have a very small amount of cream, it's not that bad at all. However, due to the fact that it's so incredibly easy to overconsume, it's going to go in the D tier along with milk. Next up, we have goat. Now, again, goat is a ruminant animal, so it's great. Incredibly nutrient dense, lots of the good fat. The only issue with goat is, again, it's often very lean. So for that reason, goat is going in the A tier, but if you can get a fatty goat, it would be in the S tier. Next up, we have turkey, and again, turkey is virtually identical to chicken. I'm not going to bother wasting your time repeating everything I said earlier about chicken. So everything I said about chicken, apply that to turkey. Next up, we have butter. Now, butter is pretty good. It's definitely more satiating than cream, at least in my experience, and it's great for cooking in. However, again, butter is dairy. I see a lot of people mass consuming butter as their main source of fat. Now, this isn't necessarily bad. In fact, butter contains lots of essential nutrients, and the fat that's in butter does hold a good fatty acid profile. However, it's just not quite as nutrient dense as tallow. And because it's pasteurized and because it's dairy, it is going to be somewhat inflammatory. However, I do think that butter, pending you're not over-consuming it once again, because like with cream, it's incredibly high in energy, I actually do think it is the best form of dairy. So for that reason, butter is going to go in the B tier. And then ghee is essentially butter that's had its protein and moisture content stripped from it. So ghee is very similar to butter, and therefore ghee is going to sit alongside butter in the B tier. And then finally, we have yogurt and kefir, which in my opinion are better than any form of milk due to the fact that they contain less carbohydrates. There's also the argument that due to the cultures they contain, it's good for our gut microbiome. Now, this is all good and well, but truth be told, we actually don't know what a healthy gut microbiome looks like. We have all the plant-based crowd that talks about Eating fibre gives your gut microbiome something to eat, and when you eat more plants, you have a more diverse bacteria, and that's a good thing. But as we know, humans are not meant to consume plants. So whilst the argument can be made that all these live cultures are good for us, we don't 100% know. But because it contains less carbohydrates, I'm going to chuck it in the C tier along with raw milk.
In today's video, I'm going to break down 21 essential carnivore diet tips that everyone should know, so that by the end of this video, you know exactly what to do to achieve the best results on the carnivore diet. If you don't know who I am, my name is Max German. I'm an online trainer who's helped hundreds of people lose weight with the carnivore diet. The first tip is to eat your favorite meats. A lot of people say that on the carnivore diet, it's best if you only eat red meat. And while this might be true, at the start you don't want to get bored, so it's very good to have some variety. This way it makes it more interesting and you're much more likely to stick to it. The second tip is to avoid fasting. When you first hop on the carnivore diet, a lot of things are changing in your body, one of which is your body's primary fuel source. For most people, their body's used to running on carbohydrates, and when they go on the carnivore diet, they switch over to fats. During this process, your hunger hormones are all out of whack. It makes it a lot harder to fast. So when you're starting carnivore, avoid fasting, eat when you're hungry, and you'll be sweet. By avoiding fasting, it's going to become a lot easier to stick to. Once you're fat adapted and your body is used to running on fats, fasting becomes incredibly easy. In fact, one time I said to myself, you know what, I'm just going to not eat until I get hungry. And I literally didn't eat for 2.5 days. And even then, I wasn't even hungry. I just had something on. I was like, man, I probably should eat something now. Fasting will become incredibly easy in time. So if later on, somewhere down the line, fasting is something that you want to do, it is incredibly easy. But at the start, I would avoid it. The third tip is to not listen to others. What will happen is a lot of people will go on the carnivore diet, they'll feel amazing, they'll lose all this weight, they'll have all these positive benefits, and then what will happen is they'll have a friend or family member say to them, you know, eating all that meat's bad for you. And so they get all nervous, they become disheartened, oh, what are people going to think of me? And so they decide to stop. So make sure once you start having all these amazing results, you don't let one person's opinion completely throw you off track. The next tip is to remember that the start is hard, but it gets easier and easier as time goes on. Over time, when you avoid all the processed garbage that messes with your taste buds, meat starts tasting nicer and nicer. A lot of people think, oh, I'm going to get sick of meat if I continue eating it over and over again. However, you talk to anyone who's done this diet for an extended period of time, every steak tastes better than the last one. Like genuinely, the steak I just had was one of the best steaks I've ever had in my life. And I've literally eaten beef for 99.9% of my meals for the last 6 months. So when you're 5 days into it and you're thinking to yourself, geez, I'm not sure how much longer I can continue doing this all meat thing. Remember, starts tasting better and better over time. You also might have to deal with the keto flu, which as I mentioned at the start, your body's used to running on carbohydrates and now it has to get used to running on fat. Now this should only last a few days. During these few days, you may notice a massive drop in energy. However, you need to remind yourself, this isn't forever, and after those few days are up, you're going to have so much energy, it's going to be unbelievable. The next tip is to remind yourself that the cravings aren't going to last forever. For the first week or so, you might have some pretty crazy cravings. However, within a week, they're all going to completely vanish. Now, the reason these cravings go away after a week is pretty complicated, but I made an entire video on this topic the other day, which I'll link to at the end of this video. The next tip is to make sure that you're including salt, and a lot of it too. The carnivore diet is a low carbohydrate diet, and when you're in a low carbohydrate state, you excrete more electrolytes. Salt is an electrolyte, so in order to make sure that your electrolyte levels stay where they need to be, you need to ensure that you're consuming a little bit more than you normally would. You also need to remember that the processed garbage you ate beforehand contained absurd amounts of salt. So whatever salt you'd usually put on a steak, double it. The best way to do this is to simply put as much salt on as what tastes good. At the start, it might seem like an extreme amount. Over time, however, as your body gets used to this low carbohydrate state, it'll stop requiring so much salt. The next tip, which is a very important one, is to learn the mechanisms behind each food. Everyone that goes on the carnivore diet knows plants have defense chemicals which are harmful to us. However, it's so easy to convince yourself that just going off it every now and then isn't going to affect you too much, and to look at everyone else. You know, most people in society eat plants all day and rah-de-rah-de-rah. However, once you start to learn the individual mechanisms behind each plant, you start to slowly become repulsed by it. Like genuinely, I used to be addicted to junk food. Now every time I see it, I genuinely get like angry on the inside. I cannot believe that they're feeding this to people. Now I know I see that this tip is important, but the next one might be the most important on the list, and that is to invest in a toothpick company. Seriously, whenever you eat a steak, you usually get some of it stuck in your teeth. So when your entire diet is steak, you can imagine how much food you have in your teeth. I have to go through so many toothpicks. The next tip is to eat enough fat. Seriously, so many people are scared of fat, Fat is not something to fear. Now, the reason most people are scared of it is because the word fat sounds like fat. And what I mean by this is that a lot of people assume that by eating fat, it's going to turn into fat. However, this is not the case. Fat is what makes you feel full, so you don't overeat, which therefore means you don't become fat, as well as the fact that it's essential for our hormone production and for our energy levels. Do not be scared of fat. You need to consume a decent amount on this diet to thrive. Remember, nobody ever got fat eating animal fats. The only reason people are fat is because we have so many carbohydrates in our diet, as well as these toxic oils that cause inflammation in our body and ruin everyone's metabolisms. Now, the next tip doesn't really apply to everyone, but it kinda does, and that is you should eat your fat first at the start of a meal. When you eat protein before your fat, your blood sugar is going to spike more than it would if you were to eat the fat first. So if you're someone who really needs to be in a ketogenic state, like a diabetic or someone with mental health issues, it's probably a good thing to eat your fat first. So if you have a massive fatty steak in front of you, instead of leaving the fat on the outside till the end, eat it at the same time as you eat the muscle meat. Now, you don't have to get all nervous with this when you're eating. Even if you don't do this, I'm sure it's not going to make too much of a difference. It's just for those certain groups, it may help them out just that even a little bit more. Now, the next tip is to keep your coffee and caffeine in for at least the first 30 days. When you quit caffeine, a lot of people have massive withdrawal symptoms, which leaves them feeling terrible. So they'll start the carnivore diet, remove all plants, including coffee, and they'll start feeling just terrible. And so they'll think to themselves, geez, this is weird. Everyone that goes on carnivore talks about how amazing they feel. Yet I'm 14 days in and I still don't feel myself. However, really, it's just the caffeine withdrawal is still affecting them. So in order to actually see if you feel better on carnivore, you want to keep all variables the same. So as I said, keep caffeine in for at least the first 30 days, and then if you want to remove your coffee or whatever afterwards, think about doing it then. Now, the next tip is to make sure you have a bathroom around you at all times. Now you know what? I'm just going to let Joe Rogan explain this one.
You did say something in your post about a explosive diarrhea.
It needs to have a new name. Diarrhea is not strong enough for what I was experiencing.
For real?
Yeah, it was like someone was tapping into an oil well.
Ah, jeez.
I have pictures. You want to see pictures?
Now, the reason a lot of people get this when they start carnivore is due to a couple of reasons. The first is the massive change in your gut microbiome. The bacteria in our gut is incredibly diverse. They're made up of so many different things. And when you have a massive change in your diet, it all has to change, which means it has to go out somehow. Now, if you're on a carnivore diet for your entire life and you switch to a vegan diet, you would also have some serious stomach issues when beginning. As well as the fact that for your body to break down fat, it needs something known as bile to break it down. So people will go on carnivore and massively increase the amount of fat they're eating. However, the amount of bile they make only slowly upregulates. So during this time, this fat cannot be broken down, which leaves their stools a bit runny. So if this does happen to you, don't be concerned. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just your body getting used to such a change in diet. The next tip is to watch YouTube videos for motivation. When you first start out in the carnivore diet and you're struggling a little bit like I mentioned at the start, it can be incredibly demotivating. However, if you go online and listen to all these success stories on carnivore, it can really keep you motivated and help you stick to it. A couple of great YouTubers that I highly recommend is Dante from Ferrigno Freedom and Kerry from Homestead How. When you hear the incredible stories of these men and you hear the passion in their voice when they talk about carnivore, it really makes you enthusiastic and you're much more likely to stay on track. The next tip is to avoid artificial sweeteners. A lot of people think that because these things have no calories that it's not going to affect your results. This is just simply not the case. For one, the sweet taste is going to make you crave other things, as well as the fact that because it has a sweet taste, it's still going to elevate your blood sugar, which means it's going to come crashing back down and it's going to mess with your hunger signaling, which as a result means you're going to eat more and it will stall your weight loss. The carnivore diet is an anti-inflammatory diet, and because these things are inflammatory, it will mess with your results. The next tip is to be careful with dairy. Dairy is incredibly easy to overeat, and for a number of reasons, it does cause you to gain some weight. I've made an entire video on how dairy can cause you to gain weight on carnivore, which I'll link to in the description. When it comes to dairy, you want to use it like you would a sauce. Maybe a little bit on the top and have a little bit every now and then, but you don't want to make it a massive staple in your diet. I literally see some people eating things like butter or cheese as a meal. This is going to slow your weight loss down. The next tip is to only include organ meat if you want to. A lot of people are reluctant to go on carnivore because they think they have to eat nose to tail and have to eat all these organs which they don't find particularly appealing. You can get every single nutrient you need from only muscle meat. So whatever your favorite cuts of meat are, eat those. The next tip is to do your first 30 days completely strict. A lot of people will go good all week and then reward themselves on the weekend. All this is doing is re-inflaming your body, and you're never going to be able to experience the true benefits of carnivore. So if you don't do at least 30 days strict, you're never going to be able to see just how incredibly different you feel. After 30 days of carnivore, your body will be clear of inflammation. So when you eat something off carnivore, you're going to see how it truly affects you. The next tip is that you can literally start again your next meal. If you do slip off carnivore, which does happen, you don't have to say to yourself, oh, you know what, I was doing so well, but I've slipped off and now it's all over. No, you can literally get right back on it for your next meal. A lot of people go, oh, I'll just wait till next week. It's the first week of the month, so it kind of makes sense. Then I can do my 30 days from then. All this is going to do is ruin all your hard work. Get back on it for your very next meal. Slipping off once isn't going to affect you very much at all. However, taking a few days or a week off, you're seriously going to set yourself back. So get back on it as soon as you can. The next tip is to prioritize red meat. And I know at the start that I said you can eat whatever meats you want. And you can. However, you want to make sure that at least once per day, at the bare minimum, you are eating some sort of red meat. Red meat is by far the most nutrient dense. It contains every single nutrient you need in the perfect amount. So make sure you're having it every single day. The next tip is that you only need red meat, salt, and water. A lot of people are under the assumption that you need to eat a variety of different animals and different types of meat in order to get in every single nutrient. In red meat, like I said, it has every single nutrient you need in the perfect amounts. So if the only thing you eat is red meat, you're going to be completely fine. My diet for the last 3 weeks has been only beef, and I feel the best I've ever felt in my life. The final tip is to change your perspective. A lot of people will go on carnivore and they'll see all these foods that they can't eat and they'll go, man, this sucks. I only get to eat these select few amount of foods. However, what you should be thinking is, I get to eat the greatest food on the planet for every single meal. All this other food that people eat, it's not real food. It's an addictive drug that's been marketed to the masses as food. On this diet, you get to eat real food, the greatest food on the planet, every single meal. It is seriously a blessing. So next time you're having these thoughts that you're missing out on all these foods, change your perspective to this. It will seriously help you out. Well, now that this video is finished, you are ready to start the carnivore diet. Truth be told, it's incredibly easy. But if you want some support or accountability, I do run a 28-day challenge, which I will link in the description. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.